Little Dorrit. Preface. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Preface to the 1857 edition. I have been occupied with this story during many working hours of 2 years. I must have been very ill employed, if I could not leave its merits and demerits as a whole, to express themselves on its being read as a whole. But as it is not unreasonable to suppose that I may have held its threads with a more continuous attention than any one else can have given them during its desultory publication, it is not unreasonable to ask that the weaving may be looked at in its completed state, and with the pattern finished. If I might offer any apology for so exaggerated a fiction as the Barnacles and the Circumlocution Office, I would seek it in the common experience of an Englishman, without presuming to mention the unimportant fact of my having done that violence to good manners in the days of a Russian war and of a court of inquiry at Chelsea. If I might make so bold as to defend that extravagant conception, Mr. Merdle, I would hint that it originated after the railroad share epoch, in the times of a certain Irish bank and of one or two other equally laudable enterprises. If I were to plead anything in mitigation of the preposterous fancy that a bad design will sometimes claim to be a good and an expressly religious design, it would be the curious coincidence that it has been brought to its climax in these pages, in the days of the public examination of late directors of a Royal British Bank. But I submit myself to suffer judgment to go by default on all these counts, if need be, and to accept the assurance, on good authority, that nothing like them was ever known in this land. Some of my readers may have an interest in being informed whether or no any portions of the Marshalsea prison are yet standing. I did not know myself until the 6th of this present month, when I went to look. I found the outer front courtyard, often mentioned here, metamorphosed into a butter shop, and I then almost gave up every brick of the jail for lost. Wandering, however, down a certain adjacent Angel Court leading to Bermondsey, I came to Marshalsea Place, the houses in which I recognized, not only as the great block of the former prison, but as preserving the rooms that arose in my mind's eye when I became Little Dorrit's biographer. The smallest boy I ever conversed with, carrying the largest baby I ever saw, offered a supernaturally intelligent explanation of the locality in its old uses, and was very nearly correct. How this young Newton, for such I judge him to be, came by his information I don't know. He was a quarter of a century too young to know anything about it of himself. I pointed to the window of the room where Little Dorrit was born, and where her father lived so long, and asked him what was the name of the lodger who tenanted that apartment at present. He said, "Tom Pythick." I asked him who was Tom Pythick, and he said, "Joe Pythick's uncle." A little further on, I found the older and smaller wall, which used to enclose the pent-up inner prison where nobody was put, except for ceremony. But whosoever goes into Marshalsea Place, turning out of Angel Court, leading to Bermondsey, will find his feet on the very paving stones of the extinct Marshalsea jail. Will see its narrow yard to the right and to the left, very little altered if at all, except that the walls were lowered when the place got free. Will look upon rooms in which the debtors lived, and will stand among the crowding ghosts of many miserable years. In the preface to Bleak House I remarked that I had never had so many readers. In the preface to its next successor, Little Dorrit, I have still to repeat the same words. Deeply sensible of the affection and confidence that have grown up between us, I add to this preface, as I added to that, "May we meet again." London, May, 1857. End of preface. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the First, Book the First of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the First. Chapter the First. Sun and Shadow. 30 years ago, Marseille lay burning in the sun one day. A blazing sun upon a fierce August day was no greater rarity in southern France then, than at any other time before or since. Everything in Marseille, and about Marseille, had stared at the fervid sky, and been stared at in return, until a staring habit had become universal there. Strangers were stared out of countenance by staring white houses, staring white walls, staring white streets, staring tracts of arid road, staring hills from which verdure was burnt away. The only things to be seen not fixedly staring and glaring were the vines drooping under their load of grapes. These did occasionally wink a little, as the hot air barely moved their faint leaves. There was no wind to make a ripple on the foul water within the harbour, and on the beautiful sea without. The line of demarcation between the two colours, black and blue, showed the point which the pure sea would not pass, but it lay as quiet as the abominable pool, with which it never mixed. Boats without awnings were too hot to touch. Ships blistered at their moorings. The stones of the quays had not cooled, night or day, for months. Hindus, Russians, Chinese, Spaniards, Portuguese, Englishmen, Frenchmen, Genoese, Neapolitans, Venetians, Greeks, Turks, descendants from all the builders of Babel, come to trade at Marseille, sought the shade alike, taking refuge in any hiding place from a sea too intensely blue to be looked at, and a sky of purple, set with one great flaming jewel of fire. The universal stare made the eyes ache. Towards the distant line of Italian coast, indeed, it was a little relieved by light clouds of mist, slowly rising from the evaporation of the sea, but it softened nowhere else. Far away the staring roads, deep in dust, stared from the hillside, stared from the hollow, stared from the interminable plain. Far away the dusty vines overhanging wayside cottages, and the monotonous wayside avenues of parched trees without shade, drooped beneath the stare of earth and sky. So did the horses with drowsy bells, in long files of carts creeping slowly towards the interior. So did their recumbent drivers, when they were awake, which rarely happened. So did the exhausted labourers in the fields. Everything that lived or grew was oppressed by the glare, except the lizard, passing swiftly over rough stone walls, and the cicala, chirping his dry hot chirp like a rattle. The very dust was scorched brown, and something quivered in the atmosphere as if the air itself were panting. Blinds, shutters, curtains, awnings were all closed and drawn to keep out the stare. Grant it but a chink or keyhole, and it shot in like a white hot arrow. The churches were the freest from it. To come out of the twilight of pillars and arches, dreamily dotted with winking lamps, dreamily peopled with ugly old shadows piously dozing, spitting, and begging, was to plunge into a fiery river, and swim for life to the nearest strip of shade. So, with people lounging and lying wherever shade was, with but little hum of tongues or barking of dogs, with occasional jangling of discordant church bells, and rattling of vicious drums, Marseille, a fact to be strongly smelt and tasted, lay broiling in the sun one day. In Marseille that day there was a villainous prison. In one of its chambers, so repulsive a place that even the obtrusive stare blinked at it, and left it to such refuse of reflected light as it could find for itself, were 2 men. Besides the 2 men, a notched and disfigured bench, immovable from the wall, with a draught board rudely hacked upon it with a knife, a set of draughts made of old buttons and soup bones, a set of dominoes, 2 mats, and 2 or 3 wine bottles. That was all the chamber held, exclusive of rats and other unseen vermin, in addition to the seen vermin, the 2 men. It received such light as it got through a grating of iron bars fashioned like a pretty large window, by means of which it could be always inspected from the gloomy staircase on which the grating gave. There was a broad strong ledge of stone to this grating, where the bottom of it was let into the masonry, 3 or 4 feet above the ground. Upon it, one of the 2 men lolled, half sitting and half lying, with his knees drawn up, and his feet and shoulders planted against the opposite sides of the aperture. The bars were wide enough apart to admit of his thrusting his arm through to the elbow, and so he held on negligently for his greater ease. A prison taint was on everything there. The imprisoned air, the imprisoned light, the imprisoned damps, the imprisoned men, were all deteriorated by confinement. As the captive men were faded and haggard, so the iron was rusty, the stone was slimy, the wood was rotten, the air was faint, the light was dim. Like a well, like a vault, like a tomb, the prison had no knowledge of the brightness outside, and would have kept its polluted atmosphere intact in one of the space islands of the Indian Ocean. The man who lay on the ledge of the grating was even chilled. He jerked his great cloak more heavily upon him by an impatient movement of one shoulder, and growled, "To the devil with this brigand of a sun that never shines in here!" He was waiting to be fed, looking sideways through the bars that he might see the further down the stairs, with much of the expression of a wild beast in similar expectation. But his eyes, too close together, were not so nobly set in his head as those of the king of beasts are in his, and they were sharp rather than bright, pointed weapons with little service to betray them. They had no depth or change. They glittered, and they opened and shut. So far, and waiving their use to himself, a clockmaker could have made a better pair. He had a hook nose, handsome after its kind, but too high between the eyes by probably just as much as his eyes were too near to one another. For the rest, he was large and tall in frame, had thin lips, where his thick moustache showed them at all, and a quantity of dry hair of no definable colour, and its shaggy state but shot with red. The hand with which he held the grating, seamed all over the black with ugly scratches newly healed, was unusually small and plump, would have been unusually white but for the prison grime. The other man was lying on the stone floor, covered with a coarse brown coat. "Get up, pig," growled the first. "Don't sleep while I am hungry." "It's all one, master," said the pig in a submissive manner, and not without cheerfulness. "I can wake when I will, I can sleep when I will, it's all the same." As he said it he rose, shook himself, scratched himself, tied his brown coat loosely round his neck by the sleeves (he had previously used it as a coverlet), and sat down upon the pavement yawning, with his back against the wall opposite the grating. "Say what the hour is," grumbled the first man. "The midday bells will ring in 40 minutes. When he made the little pause, he had looked round the prison room, as if for certain information. "You are a clock. How is it that you always know?" "How can I say? I always know what the hour is, and where I am. I was brought in here at night, and out of a boat, but I know where I am. See here, Marseilles harbour," on his knees on the pavement, mapping it all out with a swarthy forefinger. "Toulon, where the galleys are, Spain over there, Algiers over there, creeping away here to the left, Nice, round by the cornice to Genoa, Genoa Mall and harbour, quarantine ground, city there, terrace gardens blushing with the belladonna, here Portofino, stand out for Leghorn, out again for Civita Vecchia, sail away to, hey, there is no room for Naples." He had got to the wall by this time. "But it's all one, it's in there." He remained on his knees, looking up at his fellow prisoner with a lively look for a prison. A sunburnt, quick, lithe little man, though rather thick-set, earrings in his brown ears, white teeth lighting up his grotesque brown face, intensely black hair clustering about his brown throat, a ragged red shirt open at his brown breast, loose, seaman-like trousers, decent shoes, a long red cap, a red sash round his waist, and a knife in it. "Judge if I come back from Naples as I went. See here, my master, Civitavecchia, Leghorn, Portofino, Genoa, Cornice, off Nice, which is in there, Marseille, you and me. The apartment of the jailer and his keys is where I put this thumb, and here at my wrist they keep the national razor in its case, the guillotine locked up." The other man spat suddenly on the pavement and gurgled in his throat. Some lock below gurgled in its throat immediately afterwards, and then a door crashed. Slow steps began ascending the stairs. The prattle of a sweet little voice mingled with the noise they made, and the prison-keeper appeared carrying his daughter, 3 or 4 years old, and a basket. "How goes the world this forenoon, gentlemen? My little one, you see, going round with me to have a peep at her father's birds. Fie, then! Look at the birds, my pretty, look at the birds." He looked sharply at the birds himself, as he held the child up at the grate, especially at the little bird whose activity he seemed to mistrust. "I have brought your bread, Signor John Baptist," said he. They all spoke in French, but the little man was an Italian. "And if I might recommend you not to game—" "You don't recommend the master?" said John Baptist, showing his teeth as he smiled. "Oh, but the master wins," returned the jailer, with a passing look of no particular liking at the other man, "and you lose. It's quite another thing. You get husky bread and sour drink by it, and he gets sausage of Lyons, veal and savoury jelly, white bread, stracchino cheese, and good wine by it. Look at the birds, my pretty." "Poor birds," said the child. The fair little face, touched with divine compassion as it peeped shrinkingly through the grate, was like an angel's in the prison. John Baptist rose and moved towards it, as if it had a good attraction for him. The other bird remained as before, except for an impatient glance at the basket. "Stay," said the jailer, putting his little daughter on the outer ledge of the grate. "She shall feed the birds. This big loaf is for Signor John Baptist. We must break it to get it through into the cage. So, there's a tame bird to kiss the little hand. This sausage and a vine leaf is for Monsieur Rigaud. Again, this veal and savoury jelly is for Monsieur Rigaud. Again, these 3 white little loaves are for Monsieur Rigaud. Again, this cheese. Again, this wine. Again, this tobacco, all for Monsieur Rigaud. Lucky bird." The child put all these things between the bars into the soft, smooth, well-shaped hand with evident dread, more than once drawing back her own and looking at the man with her fair brow roughened into an expression half of fright and half of anger. Whereas she had put the lump of coarse bread into the swart, scaled, knotted hands of John Baptist, who had scarcely as much nail on his 8 fingers and 2 thumbs as would have made out one for Monsieur Rigaud, with ready confidence, and when he kissed her hand, had herself passed it caressingly over his face. Monsieur Rigaud, indifferent to this distinction, propitiated the father by laughing and nodding at the daughter as often as she gave him anything, and so soon as he had all his viands about him in convenient nooks on the ledge on which he rested, began to eat with an appetite. When Monsieur Rigaud laughed, a change took place in his face that was more remarkable than prepossessing. His moustache went up under his nose, and his nose came down over his moustache, in a very sinister and cruel manner. "There," said the jailer, turning his basket upside down to beat the crumbs out, "I have expended all the money I received. Here is the note of it, and that's a thing accomplished. Monsieur Rigaud, as I expected yesterday, the President will look for the pleasure of your society at an hour after midday to-day." "To try me, eh?" said Rigaud, pausing, knife in hand and morsel in mouth. "You have said it, to try you." "There is no news for me?" asked John Baptist, who had begun contentedly to munch his bread. The jailer shrugged his shoulders. "Lady of mine, am I to lie here all my life, my father?" "What do I know?" cried the jailer, turning upon him with a southern quickness, and gesticulating in both his hands and all his fingers, as if he were threatening to tear him to pieces. "My friend, How is it possible for me to tell how long you are to lie here? What do I know, John Baptist Cavaletto? Death of my life! There are prisoners here sometimes who are not in such a devil of a hurry to be tried." He seemed to glance obliquely at Monsieur Rigaud in this remark, but Monsieur Rigaud had already resumed his meal, though not with quite so quick an appetite as before. "Adieu, my birds," said the keeper of the prison, taking his pretty child in his arms, and dictating the words with a kiss. "Adieu, my birds," the pretty child repeated. Her innocent face looked back so brightly over his shoulder, as he walked away with her, singing her the song of the child's game. "Who passes by this road so late? Compagnon de la Marjolaine. Who passes by this road so late? Always gay." That John Baptist felt it a point of honour to reply at the grate, and in good time and tune, though a little hoarsely. "Of all the king's knights 'tis the flower, Compagnon de la Marjolaine. Of all the king's knights 'tis the flower, always gay." Which accompanied them so far down the few steep stairs, that the prison keeper had to stop at last for his little daughter to hear the song out, and repeat the refrain while they were yet inside. Then the child's head disappeared, and the prison keeper's head disappeared, but the little voice prolonged the strain until the door clashed. Monsieur Rigaud, finding the listening John Baptist in his way before the echoes had ceased, even the echoes were the weaker for imprisonment, and seemed to lag, reminded him with a push of his foot that he had better resume his own darker place. The little man sat down again upon the pavement with the negligent ease of one who was thoroughly accustomed to pavements, and placing 3 hunks of coarse bread before himself, and falling to upon a 4th, began contentedly to work his way through them, as if to clear them off were a sort of game. Perhaps he glanced at the Lyons sausage, and perhaps he glanced at the veal in savoury jelly, but they were not there long, to make his mouth water. Monsieur Rigaud soon dispatched them, in spite of the president and tribunal, and proceeded to suck his fingers as clean as he could, and to wipe them on his vine leaves. Then, as he paused in his drink to contemplate his fellow prisoner, his moustache went up and his nose came down. "How do you find the bread?" "A little dry, but I have my old sauce here," returned John Baptist, holding up his knife. "How sauce?" "I can cut my bread so like a melon, or so like an omelette, or so like a fried fish, or so like Lyons sausage," said John Baptist, demonstrating the various cuts of the bread he held, and soberly chewing what he had in his mouth. "Here," cried Monsieur Rigaud, "you may drink, you may finish this." It was no great gift, for there was mighty little wine left, but Signor Cavaletto, jumping to his feet, received the bottle gratefully, turned it upside down at his mouth, and smacked his lips. "Put the bottle by with the rest," said Rigaud. The little man obeyed his orders, and stood ready to give him a lighted match, for he was now rolling his tobacco into cigarettes by the aid of little squares of paper which had been brought in with it. "Here, you may have one." "A thousand thanks, my master," John Baptist said in his own language, and with the quick conciliatory manner of his own countrymen. Monsieur Rigaud arose, lighted a cigarette, put the rest of his stock into a breast-pocket, and stretched himself out at full length upon the bench. Cavaletto sat down on the pavement, holding one of his ankles in each hand, and smoking peacefully. There seemed to be some uncomfortable attraction of Monsieur Rigaud's eyes to the immediate neighbourhood of that part of the pavement where the thumb had been in the plan. They were so drawn in that direction, that the Italian more than once followed them to and back from the pavement in some surprise. "What an infernal hole this is!" said Monsieur Rigaud, breaking a long pause. "Look at the light of day. Day, the light of yesterday week, the light of 6 months ago, the light of 6 years ago, so slack and dead." It came languishing down a square funnel that blinded a window in the staircase wall, through which the sky was never seen, nor anything else. Cavaletto, said Monsieur Rigaud, suddenly withdrawing his gaze from this funnel to which they had both involuntarily turned their eyes. You know me for a gentleman? Surely, surely. How long have we been here? I, 11 weeks, tomorrow night at midnight. You, 9 weeks and 3 days, at 5 this afternoon. Have I ever done anything here? Ever touched the broom, or spread the mats, or rolled them up, or found the draughts, or collected the dominoes, or put my hand to any kind of work? Never. Have you ever thought of looking to me to do any kind of work? John Baptist answered with that peculiar back-handed shake of the right forefinger which is the most expressive negative in the Italian language. No, you knew from the first moment when you saw me here that I was a gentleman. Altro, returned John Baptist, closing his eyes and giving his head a most vehement toss. The word being, according to its Genoese emphasis, a confirmation, a contradiction, an assertion, a denial, a taunt, a compliment, a joke, and 50 other things, became in the present instance, with a significance beyond all power of written expression, our familiar English, I believe you. Ha ha! You are right. A gentleman I am, and a gentleman I'll live, and a gentleman I'll die. It's my intent to be a gentleman. It's my game. Death of my soul, I play it out wherever I go. He changed his posture to a sitting one, crying with a triumphant air, Here I am, see me, shaken out of destiny's dice box into the company of a mere smuggler, shut up with a poor little contraband trader, whose papers are wrong, and whom the police lay hold of besides, for placing his boat, as a means of getting beyond the frontier, at the disposition of other little people whose papers are wrong, and he instinctively recognizes my position, even by this light and in this place. It's well done, by heaven! I win, however the game goes. Again his moustache went up, and his nose came down. What's the hour now? He asked, with a dry hot pallor upon him, rather difficult of association with merriment. A little half-hour after midday. Good. The President will have a gentleman before him soon. Come. Shall I tell you on what accusation? It must be now or never, for I shall not return here. Either I shall go free, or I shall go to be made ready for shaving. You know where they keep the razor. Signor Cavaletto took his cigarette from between his parted lips, and showed more momentary discomfiture than might have been expected. I am a... Monsieur Rigaud stood up to say it. I am a cosmopolitan gentleman. I own no particular country. My father was Swiss, Canton du Vaud. My mother was French by blood, English by birth. I myself was born in Belgium. I am a citizen of the world. His theatrical air, as he stood with one arm on his hip within the folds of his cloak, together with his manner of disregarding his companion and addressing the opposite wall instead, seemed to intimate that he was rehearsing for the President, whose examination he was shortly to undergo, rather than troubling himself merely to enlighten so small a person as John Baptist Cavaletto. Call me 35 years of age. I have seen the world. I have lived here, and lived there, and lived like a gentleman everywhere. I have been treated and respected as a gentleman universally. If you try to prejudice me by making out that I have lived by my wits, how do your lawyers live, your politicians, your intriguers, your men of the exchange? He kept his small smooth hand in constant requisition, as if it were a witness to his gentility that had often done him good service before. 2 years ago I came to Marseilles. I admit that I was poor. I had been ill. When your lawyers, your politicians, your intriguers, your men of the exchange fall ill, and have not scraped money together, they become poor. I put up at the Cross of Gold, kept then by Monsieur Henri Barreneau, 65 at least, and in a failing state of health. I had lived in the house some 4 months when Monsieur Henri Barreneau had the misfortune to die. At any rate, not a rare misfortune that. It happens without any aid of mine pretty often." John Baptist having smoked his cigarette down to his fingers' ends, Monsieur Rigaud had the magnanimity to throw him another. He lighted the second at the ashes of the first, and smoked on, looking sideways at his companion, who, preoccupied with his own case, hardly looked at him. Monsieur Baronu left a widow. She was 22. She had gained a reputation for beauty, and, which is often another thing, was beautiful. I continued to live at the Cross of Gold. I married Madame Baronu. It is not for me to say whether there was any great disparity in such a match. Here I stand, with the contamination of a jail upon me, but it is possible that you may think me better suited to her than her former husband was. He had a certain air of being a handsome man, which he was not, and a certain air of being a well-bred man, which he was not. It was mere swagger and challenge, but in this particular, as in many others, blustering assertion goes for proof, half over the world. Be it as it may, Madame Baronu approved of me. That is not to prejudice me, I hope. His eye happening to light upon John Baptist with this inquiry, that little man briskly shook his head in the negative, and repeated in an argumentative tone under his breath, altro, 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 an infinite number of times. Now came the difficulties of our position. I am proud. I say nothing in defence of pride, but I am proud. It is also my character to govern. I can't submit. I must govern. Unfortunately, the property of Madame Rigaud was settled upon herself. Such was the insane act of her late husband. More unfortunately still, she had relations. When a wife's relations interpose against a husband who is a gentleman, who is proud and who must govern, the consequences are inimical to peace. There was yet another source of difference between us. Madame Rigaud was unfortunately a little vulgar. I sought to improve her manners and ameliorate her general tone. She, supported in this likewise by her relations, resented my endeavours. Quarrels began to arise between us, and, propagated and exaggerated by the slanders of the relations of Madame Rigaud, to become notorious to the neighbours. It has been said that I treated Madame Rigaud with cruelty. I may have been seen to slap her face, nothing more. I have a light hand, and if I have been seen apparently to correct Madame Rigaud in that manner, I have done it almost playfully. If the playfulness of Monsieur Rigaud were at all expressed by his smile at this point, the relations of Madame Rigaud might have said that they would have much preferred his correcting that unfortunate woman seriously. I am sensitive and brave. I do not advance it as a merit to be sensitive and brave, but it is my character. If the male relations of Madame Rigaud had put themselves forward openly, I should have known how to deal with them. They knew that, and their machinations were conducted in secret. Consequently, Madame Rigaud and I were brought into frequent and unfortunate collision. Even when I wanted any little sum of money for my personal expenses, I could not obtain it without collision, and I, too, a man whose character it is to govern. One night, Madame Rigaud and myself were walking amicably, I may say like lovers, on a height overhanging the sea. An evil star occasioned Madame Rigaud to advert to her relations. I reasoned with her on that subject, and remonstrated on the want of duty and devotion manifested in her allowing herself to be influenced by their jealous animosity towards her husband. Madame Rigaud retorted. I retorted. Madame Rigaud grew warm. I grew warm and provoked her. I admit it. Frankness is a part of my character. At length Madame Rigaud, in an excess of fury that I must ever deplore, threw herself upon me with screams of passion, no doubt those that were overheard at some distance, tore my clothes, tore my hair, lacerated my hands, trampled and trod the dust, and finally leaped over, dashing herself to death upon the rocks below. Such is the train of incidents which malice has perverted into my endeavouring to force from Madame Rigaud a relinquishment of her rights, and on her persistence in a refusal to make the concession I required, struggling with her, assassinating her. He stepped aside to the ledge where the vine leaves yet lay strewn about, collected 2 or 3, and stood wiping his hands upon them, with his back to the light. "Well?" he demanded after a silence. "Have you nothing to say to all that?" "It's ugly," returned the little man who had risen, and was brightening his knife upon his shoe as he leaned an arm against the wall. "What do you mean?" John Baptist polished his knife in silence. "Do you mean that I have not represented the case correctly?" "Altro," returned John Baptist. The word was an apology now, and stood for, "Oh, by no means." "What then?" "Presidents and tribunals are so prejudiced." "Well," cried the other, uneasily flinging the end of his cloak over his shoulder with an oath, "let them do their worst." "Truly I think they will," murmured John Baptist to himself, as he bent his head to put his knife in his sash. Nothing more was said on either side, though they both began walking to and fro, and necessarily crossed at every turn. Monsieur Rigaud sometimes stopped, as if he were going to put his case in a new light, or make some irate remonstrance, but Signor Cavaletto, continuing to go slowly to and fro at a grotesque kind of jog-trot pace, with his eyes turned downward, nothing came of these inclinings. By and by the noise of the key in the lock arrested them both. The sound of voices succeeded, and the tread of feet. The door clashed, the voices and the feet came on, and the prison keeper slowly ascended the stairs, followed by a guard of soldiers. "Now, Monsieur Rigaud," said he, pausing for a moment at the grate, with his keys in his hands, "have the goodness to come out." "I am to depart in state, I see." "Why, unless you did," returned the jailer, "you might depart in so many pieces that it would be difficult to get you together again. There's a crowd, Monsieur Rigaud, and it doesn't love you." He passed on out of sight, and unlocked and unbarred a low door in the corner of the chamber. "Now," said he, as he opened it and appeared within, "come out." There is no sort of whiteness in all the hues under the sun at all like the whiteness of Monsieur Rigaud's face as it was then. Neither is there any expression of the human countenance at all like that expression in every little line of which the frightened heart is seen to beat. Both are conventionally compared with death, but the difference is the whole deep gulf between the struggle done and the fight at its most desperate extremity. He lighted another of his paper cigars at his companion's, put it tightly between his teeth, covered his head with a soft slouched hat, threw the end of his cloak over his shoulder again, and walked out into the side gallery on which the door opened, without taking any further notice of Signor Cavaletto. As to that little man himself, his whole attention had become absorbed in getting near the door and looking out at it. Precisely as a beast might approach the opened gate of his den and eye the freedom beyond, he passed those few moments in watching and peering, until the door was closed upon him. There was an officer in command of the soldiers, a stout, serviceable, profoundly calm man, with his drawn sword in his hand, smoking a cigar. He very briefly directed the placing of Monsieur Rigaud in the midst of the party, but himself with consummate indifference at their head, gave the word "march," and so they all went jingling down the staircase. The door clashed, the key turned, and a ray of unusual light, and a breath of unusual air seemed to have passed through the jail, vanishing in a tiny wreath of smoke from the cigar. Still, in his captivity like a lower animal, like some impatient ape, or roused bear of the smaller species, the prisoner, now left solitary, had jumped upon the ledge to lose no glimpse of this departure. As yet he stood clasping the grate with both hands. An uproar broke upon his hearing. Yells, shrieks, oaths, threats, execrations, all comprehended in it, though, as in a storm, nothing but a raging swell of sound distinctly heard. Excited into a still greater resemblance to a caged wild animal by his anxiety to know more, the prisoner leaped nimbly down, ran round the chamber, leaped nimbly up again, clasped the grate and tried to shake it, leaped down and ran, leaped up and listened, and never rested until the noise, becoming more and more distant, had died away. How many better prisoners have worn their noble hearts out so? No man thinking of it, not even the beloved of their souls realizing it. Great kings and governors, who had made them captive, careering in the sunlight jauntily, and men cheering them on. Even the said great personages dying in bed, making exemplary ends and sounding speeches, and polite history, more servile than their instruments, embalming them. At last John Baptist, now able to choose his own spot within the compass of those walls for the exercise of his faculty of going to sleep when he would, lay down upon the bench, with his face turned over on his crossed arms, and slumbered. In his submission, in his lightness, in his good humour, in his short-lived passion, in his easy contentment with hard bread and hard stones, in his ready sleep, in his fits and starts, altogether a true son of the land that gave him birth. The white stare stared itself out for one while. The sun went down in a red, green, golden glory. The stars came out in the heavens, and the fireflies mimicked them in the lower air, as men may feebly imitate the goodness of a better order of things. The long dusty roads and the interminable plains were in repose, and so deep a hush was on the sea, that it scarcely whispered of the time when it shall give up its dead. End of chapter the first, book the first. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the second, book the first, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the first, chapter the second, Fellow Travellers. No more of yesterday's howling over yonder today, sir, is there? I have heard none. Then you may be sure there is none. When these people howl, they howl to be heard. Most people do, I suppose. Ah, but these people are always howling, never happy otherwise. Do you mean the Marseille people? I mean the French people. They're always at it. As to Marseille, we know what Marseille is. It sent the most insurrectionary tune into the world that was ever composed. It couldn't exist without a longing and marchonging to something or other, victory or death, or blazes or something. The speaker, with a whimsical good humour upon him all the time, looked over the parapet wall with the greatest disparagement of Marseille, and taking up a determined position by putting his hands in his pockets and rattling his money at it, apostrophized it with a short laugh. Her long and marchong, indeed! It would be more creditable to you, I think, to let other people along and marchong about their lawful business, instead of shutting 'em up in quarantine. Tiresome enough, said the other, but we shall be out to-day. Out to-day? Repeated the first. It's almost an aggravation of the enormity that we shall be out to-day. Out? What have we ever been in for? For no very strong reason, I must say, but as we come from the East, and as the East is the country of the plague— The plague, repeated the other. That's my grievance. I have had the plague continually, ever since I have been here. I am like a sane man shut up in a madhouse. I can't stand the suspicion of the thing. I came here as well as ever I was in my life, but to suspect me of the plague is to give me the plague. I have had it, and I have got it. You bear it very well, Mr. Meagles, said the second speaker, smiling. No, if you knew the real state of the case, that's the last observation you would think of making. I have been waking up night after night, and saying, now I have got it, now it has developed itself, Now I am in for it. Now these fellows are making out their case for their precautions. Why, I'd as soon have a spit put through me, and be stuck upon a card in a collection of beetles, as lead the life I have been leading here. Well, Mr. Meagles, say no more about it now it's over, urged a cheerful feminine voice. Over? Repeated Mr. Meagles, who appeared, though without any ill nature, to be in that peculiar state of mind in which the last word spoken by anybody else is a new injury. Over? And why should I say no more about it because it's over? It was Mrs. Meagles who had spoken to Mr. Meagles, and Mrs. Meagles was, like Mr. Meagles, comely and healthy, with a pleasant English face, which had been looking at homely things for 55 years or more, and shone with a bright reflection of them. There, never mind, father, never mind, said Mrs. Meagles. For goodness' sake, content yourself with Pet. With Pet? Repeated Mr. Meagles in his injured vein. Pet, however, being close behind him, touched him on the shoulder, and Mr. Meagles immediately forgave Marseille from the bottom of his heart. Pet was about 20, a fair girl with rich brown hair hanging free in natural ringlets, a lovely girl with a frank face and wonderful eyes, so large, so soft, so bright, set to such perfection in her kind good head. She was round and fresh, and dimpled and spoilt, and there was in Pet an air of timidity and dependence, which was the best weakness in the world, and gave her the only crowning charm a girl so pretty and pleasant could have been without. Now I ask you, said Mr. Meagles in the blandest confidence, falling back a step himself, and handing his daughter a step forward to illustrate his question. I ask you simply, as between man and man, you know, did you ever hear of such damned nonsense as putting Pet in quarantine? It has had the result of making even quarantine enjoyable. Come, said Mr. Meagles, that's something to be sure. I am obliged to you for that remark. Now, Pet, my darling, you had better go along with mother and get ready for the boat. The officer of health, and a variety of humbugs in cocked hats, are coming off to let us out of this at last, and all we jailbirds are to breakfast together in something approaching to a Christian style again, before we take wing for our different destinations. Tattycoram, stick you close to your young mistress. He spoke to a handsome girl with lustrous dark hair and eyes, and very neatly dressed, who replied with a half-curtsy as she passed off in the train of Mrs. Meagles and Pet. They crossed the bare scorched terrace all three together, and disappeared through a staring wide archway. Mr. Meagles's companion, a grave dark man of 40, still stood looking towards this archway after they were gone, until Mr. Meagles tapped him on the arm. "I beg your pardon," said he, starting. "Not at all," said Mr. Meagles. They took one silent turn backward and forward in the shade of the wall, getting, at the height on which the quarantine barracks are placed, what cool refreshment of sea breeze there was at 7 in the morning. Mr. Meagles's companion resumed the conversation. "May I ask you," he said, "what is the name of—" "Tattycoram?" Mr. Meagles struck in. "I have not the least idea." "I thought," said the other, "that—" "Tattycoram?" suggested Mr. Meagles again. "Thank you. That Tattycoram was a name, and I have several times wondered at the oddity of it. Why, the fact is," said Mr. Meagles, "Mrs. Meagles and myself are, you see, practical people. That you have frequently mentioned in the course of the agreeable and interesting conversations we have had together, walking up and down on these stones," said the other, with a half-smile breaking through the gravity of his dark face. "Practical people. So, one day, 5 or 6 years ago now, when we took Pet to church at the Foundling, you have heard of the Foundling Hospital in London, similar to the institution for the found children in Paris? I have seen it. Well, one day when we took Pet to church there to hear the music, because, as practical people, it is the business of our lives to show her everything that we think can please her, Mother, my usual name for Mrs. Meagles, began to cry so that it was necessary to take her out. "What's the matter, mother?" said I, when we had brought her a little round. "You are frightening Pet, my dear." "Yes, I know that, father," says mother, "but I think it's through my loving her so much that it ever came into my head." "That ever what came into your head, mother?" "Oh dear, dear," cried mother, breaking out again, "when I saw all those children ranged tier above tier, and appealing from the Father none of them has ever known on earth, to the great Father of us all in heaven, I thought, does any wretched mother ever come here, and look among those young faces, wondering which is the poor child she brought into this forlorn world, never through all its life to know her love, her kiss, her face, her voice, even her name?" Now that was practical in mother, and I told her so. I said, "Mother, that's what I call practical in you, my dear." The other, not unmoved, assented. So I said next day, "Now, mother, I have a proposition to make that I think you'll approve of. Let us take one of those same little children to be a little maid to Pet. We are practical people, so if we should find her temper a little defective, or any of her ways a little wide of ours, we shall know what we have to take into account. We shall know what an immense deduction must be made from all the influences and experiences that have formed us. No parents, no child, brother or sister, no individuality of home, no glass slipper, or fairy godmother. And that's the way we came by Tattycoram." "And the name itself?" "By George," said Mr. Meagles, "I was forgetting the name itself. Why, she was called in the institution Harriet Beadle, an arbitrary name, of course. Now, Harriet we changed into Hattie, and then into Tatty, because as practical people we thought even a playful name might be a new thing to her, and might have a softening and affectionate kind of effect. Don't you see? As to Beadle, that I needn't say was wholly out of the question. If there is anything that is not to be tolerated on any terms, anything that is a type of jack-in-office insolence and absurdity, anything that represents in coats, waistcoats, and big sticks our English holding on by nonsense after every one has found it out, it is a Beadle. You haven't seen a Beadle lately? As an Englishman who has been more than 20 years in China, no. Then, said Mr. Meagles, laying his forefinger on his companion's breast with great animation, don't you see a Beadle now if you can help it? Whenever I see a Beadle in full fig, coming down a street on a Sunday at the head of a charity school, I am obliged to turn and run away, or I should hit him. The name of Beadle being out of the question, and the originator of the institution for these poor foundlings having been a blessed creature of the name of Coram, we gave that name to Pet's little maid. At one time she was Tatty, and at one time she was Coram, until we got into a way of mixing the two names together, and now she is always Tattycoram. Your daughter, said the other when they had taken another silent turn to and fro, and after standing for a moment at the wall glancing down at the sea, had resumed their walk, is your only child, I know, Mr. Meagles. May I ask you, in no impertinent curiosity, but because I have had so much pleasure in your society, may never in this labyrinth of a world exchange a quiet word with you again, and wish to preserve an accurate remembrance of you and yours, may I ask you, if I have not gathered from your good wife that you have had other children? No, no, said Mr. Meagles, not exactly other children, one other child. I am afraid I have inadvertently touched upon a tender theme. Never mind, said Mr. Meagles. If I am grave about it, I am not at all sorrowful. It quiets me for a moment, but does not make me unhappy. Pet had a twin sister who died when we could just see her eyes, exactly like Pet's, above the table, as she stood on tiptoe holding by it. Oh, indeed, indeed. Yes, and being practical people, a result has gradually sprung up in the minds of Mrs. Meagles and myself, which perhaps you may, or perhaps you may not, understand. Pet and her baby sister were so exactly alike, and so completely one, that in our thoughts we have never been able to separate them since. It would be of no use to tell us that our dead child was a mere infant. We have changed that child according to the changes in the child spared to us and always with us. As Pet has grown, that child has grown. As Pet has become more sensible and womanly, her sister has become more sensible and womanly by just the same degrees. It would be as hard to convince me that if I was to pass into the other world to-morrow, I should not, through the mercy of God, be received there by a daughter, just like Pet, as to persuade me that Pet herself is not a reality at my side. I understand you, said the other gently. As to her, pursued her father, the sudden loss of her little picture and playfellow, and her early association with that mystery in which we all have our equal share, but which is not often so forcibly presented to a child, has necessarily had some influence on her character. Then, her mother and I were not young when we married, and Pet has always had a sort of grown-up life with us, though we have tried to adapt ourselves to her. We have been advised more than once, when she has been a little ailing, to change climate and air for her as often as we could, especially at about this time of her life, and to keep her amused. So, as I have no need to stick at a bank desk now, though I have been poor enough in my life, I assure you, or I should have married Mrs. Meagles long before, we go trotting about the world. This is how you found us staring at the Nile, and the pyramids, and the sphinxes, and the desert, and all the rest of it. And this is how Tattycoram will be a greater traveller in course of time than Captain Cook. I thank you, said the other, very heartily for your confidence. Don't mention it, returned Mr. Meagles. I am sure you are quite welcome. And now, Mr. Clennam, perhaps I may ask you whether you have yet come to a decision where to go next? Indeed, no. I am such a waif and stray everywhere that I am liable to be drifted where any current may set. It's extraordinary to me, if you will excuse my freedom in saying so, that you don't go straight to London, said Mr. Meagles, in the tone of a confidential adviser. Perhaps I shall. Ay, but I mean with a will. I have no will, that is to say, he coloured a little, next to none that I can put in action now, trained by main force, broken, not bent, heavily ironed with an object on which I was never consulted and which was never mine, shipped away to the other end of the world before I was of age, and exiled there until my father's death there a year ago, always grinding in a mill I always hated. What is to be expected from me in middle life? Will, purpose, hope. All those lights were extinguished before I could sound the words. Light 'em up again, said Mr. Meagles. Ah, easily said. I am the son, Mr. Meagles, of a hard father and mother. I am the only child of parents who weighed, measured, and priced everything, for whom what could not be weighed, measured, and priced had no existence. Strict people, as the phrase is, professors of a stern religion, their very religion was a gloomy sacrifice of tastes and sympathies that were never their own, offered up as a part of a bargain for the security of their possessions. Austere faces, inexorable discipline, penance in this world and terror in the next, nothing graceful or gentle anywhere, and the void in my cowed heart everywhere. This was my childhood, if I may so misuse the word as to apply it to such a beginning of life. Really, though, said Mr. Meagles, made very uncomfortable by the picture offered to his imagination. That was a tough commencement, but come, you must now study and profit by all that lies beyond it like a practical man. If the people who are usually called practical were practical in your direction— Why, so they are, said Mr. Meagles. Are they indeed? Well, I suppose so, returned Mr. Meagles, thinking about it. Eh? One can but be practical, and Mrs. Meagles and myself are nothing else. My unknown cause is easier and more helpful than I had expected to find it then, said Clennam, shaking his head with his grave smile. Enough of me. Here is the boat. The boat was filled with the cocked hats to which Mr. Meagles entertained a national objection, and the wearers of those cocked hats landed and came up the steps, and all the impounded travellers congregated together. There was then a mighty production of papers on the part of the cocked hats, and a calling over of names, and great work of signing, sealing, stamping, inking, and sanding, with exceedingly blurred, gritty, and undecipherable results. Finally, everything was done according to rule, and the travellers were at liberty to depart whithersoever they would. They made little account of stare and glare, in the new pleasure of recovering their freedom, but flitted across the harbour in gay boats, and reassembled at a great hotel, whence the sun was excluded by closed lattices, and where bare paved floors, lofty ceilings, and resounding corridors tempered the intense heat. There, a great table in a great room was soon profusely covered with a superb repast, and the quarantine quarters became bare indeed, remembered among dainty dishes, southern fruits, cooled wines, flowers from Genoa, snow from the mountain tops, and all the colours of the rainbow flashing in the mirrors. "But I bear those monotonous walls no ill will now," said Mr. Meagles. "One always begins to forgive a place as soon as it's left behind. I dare say a prisoner begins to relent towards his prison after he is let out." They were about 30 in company, and all talking, but necessarily in groups. Father and Mother Meagles sat with their daughter between them, the last 3 on one side of the table. On the opposite side sat Mr. Clennam, a tall French gentleman with raven hair and beard, of a swart and terrible, not to say genteelly diabolical aspect, but who had shown himself the mildest of men, and a handsome young Englishwoman, travelling quite alone, who had a proud observant face, and had either withdrawn herself from the rest or been avoided by the rest. Nobody, herself excepted perhaps, could have quite decided which. The rest of the party were of the usual materials: travellers on business, and travellers for pleasure, officers from India on leave, merchants in the Greek and Turkey trades, a clerical English husband in a meek strait waistcoat, on a wedding trip with his young wife, a majestic English mamma and papa, of the patrician order, with a family of 3 growing-up daughters, who were keeping a journal for the confusion of their fellow creatures, and a deaf old English mother, tough in travel, with a very decidedly grown-up daughter indeed, which daughter went sketching about the universe in the expectation of ultimately toning herself off into the married state. The reserved Englishwoman took up Mr. Meagles in his last remark. "Do you mean that a prisoner forgives his prison?" said she slowly, and with emphasis. "That was my speculation, Miss Wade. I don't pretend to know positively how a prisoner might feel. I never was one before." "Mademoiselle doubts," said the French gentleman in his own language, "its being so easy to forgive." "I do." Pet had to translate this passage to Mr. Meagles, who never by any accident acquired any knowledge whatever of the language of any country into which he travelled. "Oh," said he, "dear me! But that's a pity, isn't it?" "That I am not credulous," said Miss Wade. "Not exactly that. Put it another way, that you can't believe it's easy to forgive." "My experience," she quietly returned, "has been correcting my belief in many respects for some years. It is our natural progress, I have heard." "Well, well, but it's not natural to bear malice, I hope," said Mr. Meagles cheerily. "If I had been shut up in any place to pine and suffer, I should always hate that place and wish to burn it down, or raze it to the ground. I know no more." "Strong, sir?" said Mr. Meagles to the Frenchman, it being another of his habits to address individuals of all nations in idiomatic English, with a perfect conviction that they were bound to understand it somehow. "Rather forcible in our fair friend, you'll agree with me, I think?" The French gentleman courteously replied, "Plaît-il?" To which Mr. Meagles returned with much satisfaction, "You're right. My opinion." The breakfast beginning by and by to languish, Mr. Meagles made the company a speech. It was short enough and sensible enough, considering that it was a speech at all, and hearty. It merely went to the effect that as they had all been thrown together by chance, and had all preserved a good understanding together, and were now about to disperse, and were not likely ever to find themselves all together again, what could they do better than bid farewell to one another, and give one another good speed in a simultaneous glass of cool champagne all round the table? It was done, and with a general shaking of hands the assembly broke up for ever. The solitary young lady all this time had said no more. She rose with the rest, and silently withdrew to a remote corner of the great room, where she sat herself on a couch in a window, seeming to watch the reflection of the water as it made a silver quivering on the bars of the lattice. She sat, turned away from the whole length of the apartment, as if she were lonely of her own haughty choice. And yet it would have been as difficult as ever to say, positively, whether she avoided the rest, or was avoided. The shadow in which she sat, falling like a gloomy veil across her forehead, accorded very well with the character of her beauty. One could hardly see the face, so still and scornful, set off by the arched dark eyebrows, and the folds of dark hair, without wondering what its expression would be if a change came over it. That it could soften or relent appeared next to impossible. That it could deepen into anger or any extreme of defiance, and that it must change in that direction when it changed at all, would have been its peculiar impression upon most observers. It was dressed and trimmed into no ceremony of expression. Although not an open face, there was no pretence in it. I am self-contained and self-reliant. Your opinion is nothing to me. I have no interest in you, care nothing for you, and see and hear you with indifference. This it said plainly. It said so in the proud eyes, in the lifted nostril, in the handsome but compressed and even cruel mouth. Cover either two of those channels of expression, and the third would have said so still. Mask them all, and the mere turn of the head would have shown an unsubduable nature. Pet had moved up to her. She had been the subject of remark among her family and Mr. Clennam, who were now the only other occupants of the room, and was standing at her side. "Are you?" She turned her eyes, and Pet faltered. "Expecting anyone to meet you here, Miss Wade?" "I? No. Father is sending to the poste restante. Shall he have the pleasure of directing the messenger to ask if there are any letters for you?" "I thank him, but I know there can be none." "We are afraid," said Pet, sitting down beside her shyly and half tenderly, "that you will feel quite deserted when we are all gone." "Indeed." "Not," said Pet, apologetically and embarrassed by her eyes, "not, of course, that we are any company to you, or that we have been able to be so, or that we thought you wished it. I have not intended to make it understood that I did wish it. No, of course. But in short," said Pet, timidly touching her hand as it lay impassive on the sofa between them, "will you not allow father to tender you any slight assistance or service? He will be very glad." "Very glad," said Mr. Meagles, coming forward with his wife and Clennam. "Anything short of speaking the language I shall be delighted to undertake, I am sure." "I am obliged to you," she returned, "but my arrangements are made, and I prefer to go my own way in my own manner." "Do you?" said Mr. Meagles to himself, as he surveyed her with a puzzled look. "Well, there's character in that too. I am not much used to the society of young ladies, and I am afraid I may not show my appreciation of it as others might. A pleasant journey to you. Good-bye." She would not have put out her hand, it seemed, but that Mr. Meagles put out his so straight before her that she could not pass it. She put hers in it, and it lay there just as it had lain upon the couch. "Good-bye," said Mr. Meagles. "This is the last good-bye upon the list, for mother and I have just said it to Mr. Clennam here, and he only waits to say it to Pet. Good-bye. We may never meet again." In our course through life we shall meet the people who are coming to meet us from many strange places and by many strange roads," was the composed reply. "And what it is said to us to do to them, and what it is said to them to do to us, will all be done." There was something in the manner of these words that jarred upon Pet's ear. It implied that what was to be done was necessarily evil, and it caused her to say in a whisper, "Oh, father!" and to shrink childishly, in her spoilt way, a little closer to him. This was not lost on the speaker. "Your pretty daughter," she said, "starts to think of such things. Yet, looking full upon her, you may be sure that there are men and women already on their road, who have their business to do with you, and who will do it. Of a certainty they will do it. They may be coming hundreds, thousands of miles over the sea there. They may be close at hand now. They may be coming, for anything you know or anything you can do to prevent it, from the vilest sweepings of this very town." With the coldest of farewells, and with a certain worn expression on her beauty that gave it, though scarcely yet in its prime, a wasted look, she left the room. Now there were many stairs and passages that she had to traverse in passing from that part of the spacious house to the chamber she had secured for her own occupation. When she had almost completed the journey, and was passing along the gallery in which her room was, she heard an angry sound of muttering and sobbing. A door stood open, and within she saw the attendant upon the girl she had just left, the maid with the curious name. She stood still to look at this maid, a sullen, passionate girl. Her rich black hair was all about her face. Her face was flushed and hot, and as she sobbed and raged, she plucked at her lips with an unsparing hand. "Selfish brutes," said the girl, sobbing and heaving between whiles, "not caring what becomes of me, leaving me here hungry and thirsty and tired, to starve for anything they care. Beasts, devils, wretches." "My poor girl, what is the matter?" She looked up suddenly with reddened eyes, and with her hands suspended in the act of pinching her neck, freshly disfigured with great scarlet blots. "It's nothing to you what's the matter. It don't signify to anyone." "Oh yes, it does. I am sorry to see you so." "You are not sorry," said the girl. "You are glad. You know you are glad. I never was like this but twice over in the quarantine yonder, and both times you found me. I am afraid of you." "Afraid of me?" "Yes, you seem to come like my own anger, my own malice, my own whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but I am ill-used. I am ill-used. I am ill-used." Here the sobs and the tears, and the tearing hand, which had all been suspended together since the first surprise, went on together anew. The visitor stood looking at her with a strange, attentive smile. It was wonderful to see the fury of the contest in the girl, and the bodily struggle she made as if she were rent by the demons of old. "I am younger than she is by 2 or 3 years, and yet it's me that looks after her, as if I was old, and it's she that's always pet and called baby. I detest the name. I hate her. They make a fool of her. They spoil her. She thinks of nothing but herself. She thinks no more of me than if I was a stock on a stone." So the girl went on. "You must have patience." "I won't have patience." "If they take much care of themselves, and little or none of you, you must not mind it." "I will mind it." "Hush, be more prudent. You forget your dependent position." "I don't care for that. I'll run away. I'll do some mischief. I won't bear it. I can't bear it. I shall die if I try to bear it." The observer stood with her hand upon her own bosom, looking at the girl, as one afflicted with a diseased part might curiously watch the dissection and exposition of an analogous case. The girl raged and battled with all the force of her youth and fullness of life, until by little and little her passionate exclamations trailed off into broken murmurs, as if she were in pain. By corresponding degrees she sank into a chair, then upon her knees, then upon the ground beside the bed, drawing the coverlet with her, half to hide her shamed head and wet hair in it, and half, as it seemed, to embrace it, rather than have nothing to take to her repentant breast. "Go away from me! Go away from me! When my temper comes upon me, I am mad. I know I might keep it off if I only tried hard enough, and sometimes I do try hard enough, and at other times I don't and won't. What have I said? I knew when I said it. It was all lies. They think I am being taken care of somewhere, and have all I want. They are nothing but good to me. I love them dearly. No people could ever be kinder to a thankless creature than they always are to me. Do go away, for I am afraid of you. I am afraid of myself when I feel my temper coming, and I am as much afraid of you. Go away from me, and let me pray and cry myself better." The day passed on, and again the wide stare stared itself out, and the hot night was on Marseilles, and through it the caravan of the morning, all dispersed, went their appointed ways. And thus ever by day and night, under the sun and under the stars, climbing the dusty hills and toiling along the weary plains, journeying by land and journeying by sea, coming and going so strangely, to meet and to act and react on one another, move all we restless travellers through the pilgrimage of life. End of chapter the 2nd, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 3rd, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, Chapter the 3rd, Home. It was a Sunday evening in London, gloomy, close, and stale. Maddening church bells of all degrees of dissonance, sharp and flat, cracked and clear, fast and slow, made the brick-and-mortar echoes hideous. Melancholy streets, in a penitential garb of soot, steeped the souls of the people who were condemned to look at them out of windows, in dire despondency. In every thoroughfare, up almost every alley, and down almost every turning, some doleful bell was throbbing, jerking, tolling, as if the plague were in the city and the dead carts were going round. Everything was bolted and barred that could by possibility furnish relief to an overworked people. No pictures, no unfamiliar animals, no rare plants or flowers, no natural or artificial wonders of the ancient world. All taboo with that enlightened strictness that the ugly South Sea gods in the British Museum might have supposed themselves at home again. Nothing to see but streets, streets, streets. Nothing to breathe but streets, streets, streets. Nothing to change the brooding mind or raise it up. Nothing for the spent toiler to do, but to compare the monotony of his 7th day with the monotony of his 6 days, think what a weary life he led, and make the best of it, or the worst, according to the probabilities. At such a happy time, so propitious to the interests of religion and morality, Mr. Arthur Clennam, newly arrived from Marseilles by way of Dover, and by Dover coach the blue-eyed maid, sat in the window of a coffee-house on Ludgate Hill. 10,000 responsible houses surrounded him, frowning as heavily on the streets they composed, as if they were every one inhabited by the 10 young men of the calendar's story, who blackened their faces and bemoaned their miseries every night. 50,000 lairs surrounded him where people lived so unwholesomely that fair water put into their crowded rooms on Saturday night would be corrupt on Sunday morning. Albeit, my lord, their county member was amazed that they failed to sleep in company with their butcher's meat. Miles of close wells and pits of houses, where the inhabitants gasped for air, stretched far away towards every point of the compass. Through the heart of the town a deadly sewer ebbed and flowed, in the place of a fine, fresh river. What secular want could the million or so of human beings whose daily labour, 6 days in the week, lay among these Arcadian objects, from the sweet sameness of which they had no escape between the cradle and the grave? What secular want could they possibly have upon their 7th day? Clearly they could want nothing but a stringent policeman. Mr. Arthur Clennam sat in the window of the coffee-house on Ludgate Hill, counting one of the neighbouring bells, making sentences and burdens of songs out of it in spite of himself, and wondering how many sick people it might be the death of in the course of the year. As the hour approached, its changes of measure made it more and more exasperating. At the quarter, it went off into a condition of deadly lively importunity, urging the populace in a voluble manner to come to church, come to church, come to church. At the 10 minutes it became aware that the congregation would be scanty, and slowly hammered out in low spirits, "They won't come, they won't come, they won't come." At the 5 minutes it abandoned hope, and shook every house in the neighbourhood for 300 seconds, with one dismal swing per second, as a groan of despair. "Thank heaven," said Clennam when the hour struck and the bell stopped. But its sound had revived a long train of miserable Sundays, and the procession would not stop with the bell, but continued to march on. "Heaven forgive me," said he, "and those who trained me. How I have hated this day!" There was the dreary Sunday of his childhood, when he sat with his hands before him, scared out of his senses by a horrible tract which commenced business with the poor child by asking him in its title why he was going to perdition, a piece of curiosity that he really, in a frock and drawers, was not in a condition to satisfy, and which, for the further attraction of his infant mind, had a parenthesis in every other line with some such hiccuping references to ep.thss.c.iii, v.6 and 7. There was the sleepy Sunday of his boyhood, when, like a military deserter, he was marched to chapel by a piquet of teachers 3 times a day, morally handcuffed to another boy, and when he would willingly have bartered 2 meals of indigestible sermon for another ounce or 2 of inferior mutton at his scanty dinner in the flesh. There was the interminable Sunday of his nonage, when his mother, stern of face and unrelenting of heart, would sit all day behind a Bible, bound, like her own construction of it, in the hardest, barest, and straightest boards, with one dinted ornament on the cover like the drag of a chain, and a wrathful sprinkling of red upon the edges of the leaves, as if it, of all books, were a fortification against sweetness of temper, natural affection, and gentle intercourse. There was the resentful Sunday of a little later, when he sat down glowering and glooming through the tardy length of the day, with a sullen sense of injury in his heart, and no more real knowledge of the beneficent history of the New Testament than if he had been bred among idolaters. There was a legion of Sundays, all days of unserviceable bitterness and mortification, slowly passing before him. "Beg pardon, sir?" said a brisk waiter rubbing the table. "Wish see bedroom?" "Yes, I have just made up my mind to do it." "Chambermaid," cried the waiter. "Gellum box number 7, wish see room." "Stay," said Clennam, rousing himself. "I was not thinking of what I said. I answered mechanically. I am not going to sleep here. I am going home." "Deed, sir? Chambermaid, Gellum box number 7 not going to sleep here. Go home." He sat in the same place as the day died, looking at the dull houses opposite, and thinking, if the disembodied spirits of former inhabitants were ever conscious of them, how they must pity themselves for their old places of imprisonment. Sometimes a face would appear behind the dingy glass of a window, and would fade away into the gloom as if it had seen enough of life and had vanished out of it. Presently the rain began to fall in slanting lines between him and those houses, and people began to collect under cover of the public passage opposite, and to look out hopelessly at the sky as the rain dropped thicker and faster. Then wet umbrellas began to appear, draggled skirts and mud. What the mud had been doing with itself, or where it came from, who could say? But it seemed to collect in a moment as a crowd will, and in 5 minutes to have splashed all the sons and daughters of Adam. The lamplighter was going his rounds now, and as the fiery jet sprang up under his touch, one might have fancied them astonished at being suffered to introduce any show of brightness into such a dismal scene. Mr. Arthur Clennam took up his hat and buttoned his coat, and walked out. In the country, the rain would have developed 1,000 fresh scents, and every drop would have had its bright association with some beautiful form of growth or life. In the city, it developed only foul, stale smells, and was a sickly, lukewarm, dirt-stained, wretched addition to the gutters. He crossed by St. Paul's and went down at a long angle, almost to the water's edge, through some of the crooked and descending streets which lie, and lay more crookedly and closely than, between the river and Cheapside. Passing, now the mouldy hall of some obsolete worshipful company, now the illuminated windows of a congregationless church that seemed to be waiting for some adventurous Belzoni to dig it out and discover its history, passing silent warehouses and wharves, and here and there a narrow alley leading to the river, where a wretched little Bill, found drowned, was weeping on the wet wall. He came at last to the house he sought, an old brick house, so dingy as to be all but black, standing by itself within a gateway. Before it, a square courtyard, where a shrub or two and a patch of grass were as rank, which is saying much, as the iron railings enclosing them were rusty. Behind it, a jumble of roots. It was a double house, with long, narrow, heavily framed windows. Many years ago, it had had it in its mind to slide down sideways. It had been propped up, however, and was leaning on some half-dozen gigantic crutches, with gymnasium for the neighbouring cats, weather-stained, smoke-blackened, and overgrown with weeds, appeared in these latter days to be no very sure reliance. "Nothing changed," said the traveller, stopping to look round. "Dark and miserable as ever. A light in my mother's window, which seems never to have been extinguished since I came home twice a year from school, and dragged my box over this pavement. Well, well, well." He went up to the door, which had a projecting canopy in carved work of festooned jack towels, and children's heads with water on the brain, designed after a once popular monumental pattern, and knocked. A shuffling step was soon heard on the stone floor of the hall, and the door was opened by an old man, bent and dried, but with keen eyes. He had a candle in his hand, and he held it up for a moment to assist his keen eyes. "Oh, Mr. Arthur," he said without any emotion, "you are come at last. Step in." Mr. Arthur stepped in and shut the door. "Your figure is filled out and set," said the old man, turning to look at him with the light raised again, and shaking his head. "But you don't come up to your father, in my opinion, nor yet your mother." "How is my mother?" "She's as she always is now. Keeps her room when not actually bedridden, and hasn't been out of it 15 times in as many years, Arthur." They had walked into a spare, meagre dining-room. The old man had put the candlestick upon the table, and, supporting his right elbow with his left hand, was smoothing his leathern jaws while he looked at the visitor. The visitor offered his hand. The old man took it coldly enough, and seemed to prefer his jaws, to which he returned as soon as he could. "I doubt if your mother will approve of your coming home on the Sabbath, Arthur," he said, shaking his head wearily. "You wouldn't have me go away again?" "Oh, I am not the master. It's not what I would have. I have stood between your father and mother for a number of years. I don't pretend to stand between your mother and you." "Will you tell her that I have come home?" "Yes, Arthur, yes. Oh, to be sure. I'll tell her that you have come home. Please to wait here. You won't find the room changed." He took another candle from a cupboard, lighted it, left the first on the table, and went upon his errand. He was a short, bald old man, in a high-shouldered black coat and waistcoat, drab breeches, and long drab gaiters. He might, from his dress, have been either clerk or servant, and in fact had long been both. There was nothing about him in the way of decoration but a watch, which was lowered into the depths of its proper pocket by an old black ribbon, and had a tarnished copper key moored above it, to show where it was sunk. His head was awry, and he had a one-sided, crab-like way with him, as if his foundations had yielded at about the same time as those of the house, and he ought to have been propped up in a similar manner. "How weak am I," said Arthur Clennam when he was gone, "that I could shed tears at this reception, I who have never experienced anything else, who have never expected anything else." He not only could, but did. It was the momentary yielding of a nature that had been disappointed from the dawn of its perceptions, but had not quite given up all its hopeful yearnings yet. He subdued it, took up the candle, and examined the room. The old articles of furniture were in their old places. The plagues of Egypt, much the dimmer for the fly and smoke plagues of London, were framed and glazed upon the walls. There was the old cellaret with nothing in it, lined with lead, like a sort of coffin in compartments. There was the old dark closet, also with nothing in it, of which he had been many a time the sole contents, in days of punishment, when he had regarded it as the veritable entrance to that bourne to which the tract had found him galloping. There was the large, hard-featured clock on the sideboard, which he used to see bending its figured brows upon him with a savage joy when he was behindhand with his lessons, and which, when it was wound up once a week with an iron handle, used to sound as if it were growling in ferocious anticipation of the miseries into which it would bring him. But here was the old man come back, saying, "Arthur, I'll go before and light you." Arthur followed him up the staircase, which was panelled off into spaces like so many mourning tablets, into a dim bed-chamber, the floor of which had gradually so sunk and settled that the fireplace was in a dell. On a black bier-like sofa in this hollow, propped up behind with one great angular black bolster like the block at a state execution in the good old times, sat his mother in a widow's dress. She and his father had been at variance from his earliest remembrance. To sit speechless himself in the midst of rigid silence, glancing in dread from the one averted face to the other, had been the peacefullest occupation of his childhood. She gave him one glassy kiss, and 4 stiff fingers muffled in worsted. This embrace concluded, he sat down on the opposite side of her little table. There was a fire in the grate, as there had been night and day for 15 years. There was a kettle on the hob, as there had been night and day for 15 years. There was a little mound of damped ashes on the top of the fire, and another little mound swept together under the grate, as there had been night and day for 15 years. There was a smell of black dye in the airless room, which the fire had been drawing out of the crape and stuff of the window's dress for 15 months, and out of the bier-like sofa for 15 years. "Mother, this is a change from your old active habits." "The world has narrowed to these dimensions, Arthur," she replied, glancing round the room. "It is well for me that I never set my heart upon its hollow vanities." The old influence of her presence and her stern, strong voice so gathered about her son, that he felt conscious of a renewal of the timid chill and reserve of his childhood. "Do you never leave your room, mother?" "What with my rheumatic affection, and what with its attendant debility or nervous weakness, names are of no matter now. I have lost the use of my limbs. I never leave my room. I have not been outside this door for, tell him for how long," she said, speaking over her shoulder. "A dozen year next Christmas," returned a cracked voice out of the dimness behind. "Is that Avery?" said Arthur, looking towards it. the cracked voice replied that it was Affery, and an old woman came forward into what doubtful light there was, and kissed her hand once, then subsided again into the dimness. "I am able," said Mrs. Clennam, with a slight motion of her worsted muffled right hand towards a chair on wheels, standing before a tall writing cabinet, close shut up, "I am able to attend to my business duties, and I am thankful for the privilege. It is a great privilege, but no more of business on this day. It is a bad night, is it not?" "Yes, mother." "Does it snow?" "Snow, mother? And we only yet in September. All seasons are alike to me," she returned, with a grim kind of luxuriousness. "I know nothing of summer and winter shut up here." "The Lord has been pleased to put me beyond all that." With her cold grey eyes and her cold grey hair, and her immovable face as stiff as the folds of her stony headdress, her being beyond the reach of the seasons seemed but a fit sequence to her being beyond the reach of all changing emotions. On her little table lay 2 or 3 books, her handkerchief, a pair of steel spectacles newly taken off, and an old-fashioned gold watch in a heavy double case. Upon this last object her son's eyes and her own now rested together. "I see that you received the packet I sent you on my father's death safely, mother." "You see." "I never knew my father to show so much anxiety on any subject as that his watch should be sent straight to you. I keep it here as a remembrance of your father." It was not until the last that he expressed the wish, when he could only put his hand upon it, and very indistinctly say to me, "Your mother." A moment before I thought him wandering in his mind, as he had been for many hours. I think he had no consciousness of pain in his short illness, when I saw him turn himself in his bed and try to open it. "Was your father then not wandering in his mind when he tried to open it?" "No, he was quite sensible at that time." Mrs. Clennam shook her head, whether in dismissal of the deceased, or opposing herself to her son's opinion, was not clearly expressed. "After my father's death I opened it myself, thinking there might be, for anything I knew, some memorandum there. However, as I need not tell you, mother, there was nothing but the old silk watch paper worked in beads, which you found, no doubt, in its place between the cases where I found and left it." Mrs. Clennam signified assent, then added, "No more of business on this day," and then added, "Affery, it is 9 o'clock." Upon this, the old woman cleared the little table, went out of the room, and quickly returned with a tray on which was a dish of little rusks and a small precise pat of butter, cool, symmetrical, white, and plump. The old man, who had been standing by the door in one attitude during the whole interview, looking at the mother upstairs as he had looked at the son downstairs, went out at the same time, and after a longer absence returned with another tray on which was the greater part of a bottle of port wine, which, to judge by his panting, he had brought from the cellar, a lemon, a sugar basin, and a spice box. With these materials and the aid of the kettle, he filled the tumbler with a hot and odorous mixture, measured out and compounded with as much nicety as a physician's prescription. Into this mixture Mrs. Clennam dipped certain of the rusks and ate them, while the old woman buttered certain other of the rusks, which were to be eaten alone. When the invalid had eaten all the rusks and drunk all the mixture, the 2 trays were removed, and the books and the candle, watch, handkerchief, and spectacles were replaced upon the table. She then put on the spectacles and read certain passages aloud from a book, sternly, fiercely, wrathfully, praying that her enemies, she made them by her tone and manner expressly hers, might be put to the edge of the sword, consumed by fire, smitten by plagues and leprosy, that their bones might be ground to dust, that they might be utterly exterminated. As she read on, years seemed to fall away from her son like the imaginings of a dream, and all the old dark horrors of his usual preparation for the sleep of an innocent child to overshadow him. She shut the book and remained for a little time with her face shaded by her hand. So did the old man, otherwise still unchanged in attitude. So probably did the old woman in her dimmer part of the room. Then the sick woman was ready for bed. "Good night, Arthur. Avery will see to your accommodation. Only touch me, for my hand is tender." He touched the worsted muffling of her hand. That was nothing. If his mother had been sheathed in brass, there would have been no new barrier between them, and followed the old man and woman downstairs. The latter asked him, when they were alone together among the heavy shadows of the dining-room, would he have some supper? "No, Avery, no supper." "You shall, if you like," said Avery. "There's her to-morrow's partridge in the larder, her first this year. Say the word, and I'll cook it." No, he had not long dined, and could eat nothing. "Have something to drink, then," said Avery. "You shall have some of her bottle of port, if you like. I'll tell Jeremiah that you ordered me to bring it you." No, nor would he have that either. "It's no reason, Arthur," said the old woman, bending over him to whisper, "that because I am afeard of my life for him, you should be. You've got half the property, haven't you?" "Yes, yes." "Well, then, don't you be cowed. You're clever, Arthur, aren't you?" He nodded, as she seemed to expect an answer in the affirmative. "Then stand up against them. She's awful clever, and none but a clever one durst say a word to her. He's a clever one, oh, he's a clever one, and he gives it her when he has a mind to it. He does." "Your husband does?" "Does? It makes me shake from head to foot to hear him give it her. My husband, Jeremiah Flintwich, can conquer even your mother. What can he be but a clever one to do that?" His shuffling footstep coming towards them caused her to retreat to the other end of the room. Though a tall, hard-favoured, sinewy old woman, who in her youth might have enlisted in the Foot Guards without much fear of discovery, she collapsed before the little keen-eyed, crab-like old man. "Now, Avery," said he, "now, woman, what are you doing? Can't you find Master Arthur something or another to pick at?" Master Arthur repeated his recent refusal to pick at anything. "Very well, then," said the old man. "Make his bed. Stir yourself." His neck was so twisted that the knotted ends of his white cravat usually dangled under one ear. His natural acerbity and energy, always contending with the second nature of habitual repression, gave his features a swollen and suffused look, and altogether he had a weird appearance of having hanged himself at one time or other, and of having gone about ever since, halter and all, exactly as some timely hand had cut him down. "You'll have bitter words together to-morrow, Arthur, you and your mother," said Jeremiah. "Your having given up the business on your father's death, which she suspects, though we have left it to you to tell her, won't go off smoothly." "I have given up everything in life for the business, and the time came for me to give up that." "Good," cried Jeremiah, evidently meaning bad. "Very good. Only don't expect me to stand between your mother and you, Arthur. I stood between your mother and your father, fending off this, and fending off that, and getting crushed and pounded betwixt them. And I've done with such work." "You will never be asked to begin it again for me, Jeremiah." "Good. I'm glad to hear it, because I should have had to decline it if I had been. That's enough, as your mother says, and more than enough of such matters on a Sabbath night. Avery, woman, have you found what you want yet?" She had been collecting sheets and blankets from a press, and hastened to gather them up and to reply, "Yes, Jeremiah." Arthur Clennam helped her by carrying the load himself, wished the old man good night, and went upstairs with her to the top of the house. They mounted up and up through the musty smell of an old close house, little used, to a large garret bedroom. Meagre and spare, like all the other rooms, it was even uglier and grimmer than the rest, by being the place of banishment for the worn-out furniture. Its movables were ugly old chairs with worn-out seats, and ugly old chairs without any seats, a threadbare patternless carpet, a maimed table, a crippled wardrobe, a lean set of fire-irons like the skeleton of a set deceased, a washing-stand that looked as if it had stood for ages in a hail of dirty soap-suds, and a bedstead with 4 bare atomies of posts, each terminating in a spike, as if for the dismal accommodation of lodgers who might prefer to impale themselves. Arthur opened the long, low window, and looked out upon the old blasted and blackened forest of chimneys, and the old red glare in the sky, which had seemed to him once upon a time but a nightly reflection of the fiery environment that was presented to his childish fancy in all directions, let it look where it would. He drew in his head again, sat down at the bedside, and looked on at Affery Flintwinch making the bed. "Affery, you were not married when I went away?" She screwed her mouth into the form of saying no, shook her head, and proceeded to get a pillow into its case. "How did it happen?" "Why, Jeremiah, course," said Affery with an end of the pillow-case between her teeth. "Of course he proposed it, but how did it all come about? I should have thought that neither of you would have married. Least of all should I have thought of your marrying each other." "No more should I," said Mrs. Flintwinch, tying the pillow tightly in its case. "That's what I mean. When did you begin to think otherwise?" "Never began to think otherwise at all," said Mrs. Flintwinch. Seeing, as she patted the pillow into its place on the bolster, that he was still looking at her as if waiting for the rest of her reply, she gave it a great poke in the middle and asked, "How could I help myself?" "How could you help yourself from being married?" "Of course," said Mrs. Flintwinch. "It was no doing of mine. I'd never thought of it. I'd got something to do without thinking, indeed. She kept me to it as well as he, when she could go about, and she could go about then." "Well?" "Well?" echoed Mrs. Flintwinch. "That's what I said myself. Well? What's the use of considering? If them 2 clever ones have made up their minds to it, what's left for me to do? Nothing." "Was it my mother's project, then?" "The Lord bless you, Arthur, and forgive me the wish," cried Affery, speaking always in a low tone. "If they hadn't been both of a mind in it, how could it ever have been? Jeremiah never courted me. 'Tain't likely that he would, after living in the house with me and ordering me about for as many years as he'd done. He said to me one day, he said, 'Affery,' he said, 'now I am going to tell you something. What do you think of the name of Flintwinch?' 'What do I think of it?' I says. 'Yes,' he said, 'because you're going to take it.' He said, 'Take it?' I says, 'Jeremiah? Oh, he's a clever one.'" Mrs. Flintwinch went on to spread the upper sheet over the bed, and the blanket over that, and the counterpane over that, as if she had quite concluded her story. "Well?" said Arthur again. "Well?" echoed Mrs. Flintwinch again. "How could I help myself? He said to me, 'Affery, you and me must be married, and I'll tell you why. She's failing in health, and she'll want pretty constant attendance up in her room, and we shall have to be much with her, and there'll be nobody about now but ourselves when we are away from her, and altogether it will be more convenient. She's of my opinion,' he said, 'so if you'll put your bonnet on next Monday morning at 8, we'll get it over.'" Mrs. Flintwinch tucked up the bed. "Well?" "Well," repeated Mrs. Flintwinch, "I think so. I sits me down and says it. 'Well?' Jeremiah then says to me, 'As to banns, next Sunday being the 3rd time of asking, where I've put 'em up a fortnight, is my reason for naming Monday. She'll speak to you about it herself, and now she'll find you prepared, Affery.' That same day she spoke to me, and she said, "So, Affery, I understand that you and Jeremiah are going to be married. I am glad of it, and so are you, with reason. It is a very good thing for you, and very welcome under the circumstances to me. He is a sensible man, and a trustworthy man, and a persevering man, and a pious man. What could I say when it had come to that? Why, if it had been a smothering instead of a wedding—" Mrs. Flintwinch cast about in her mind with great pains for this form of expression. "I couldn't have said a word upon it against them two clever ones." "In good faith, I believe so." "And so you may, Arthur." "Affery, what girl was that in my mother's room just now?" "Girl?" said Mrs. Flintwinch in a rather sharp key. "It was a girl, surely, whom I saw near you, almost hidden in the dark corner." "Oh, she? Little Dorrit? She's nothing. She's a whim of hers." It was a peculiarity of Affery Flintwinch that she never spoke of Mrs. Clennam by name. "But there's another sort of girls than that about. Have you forgot your old sweetheart? Long and long ago, I'll be bound." "I suffered enough from my mother's separating us to remember her. I recollect her very well." "Have you got another?" "No." "Here's news for you, then. She's well-to-do now, and a widow, and if you like to have her, why, you can." "And how do you know that, Affery?" "Them two clever ones have been speaking about it. There's Jeremiah on the stairs." She was gone in a moment. Mrs. Flintwinch had introduced into the web that his mind was busily weaving, in that old workshop where the loom of his youth had stood, the last thread wanting to the pattern. The airy folly of a boy's love had found its way even into that house, and he had been as wretched under its hopelessness as if the house had been a castle of romance. Little more than a week ago at Marseilles, the face of the pretty girl from whom he had parted with regret had had an unusual interest for him, and a tender hold upon him, because of some resemblance, real or imagined, to this first face that had soared out of his gloomy life into the bright glories of fancy. He leaned upon the sill of the long, low window, and looking out upon the blackened forest of chimneys again, began to dream. For it had been the uniform tendency of this man's life. So much was wanting in it to think about, so much that might have been better directed and happier to speculate upon, to make him a dreamer after all. End of chapter the 3rd, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 4th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, chapter the 4th. Mrs. Flintwinch has a dream. When Mrs. Flintwinch dreamed, she usually dreamed unlike the son of her old mistress, with her eyes shut. She had a curiously vivid dream that night, and before she had left the son of her old mistress many hours. In fact, it was not at all like a dream. It was so very real in every respect. It happened in this wise. The bed-chamber occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Flintwinch was within a few paces of that to which Mrs. Clennam had been so long confined. It was not on the same floor, for it was a room at the side of the house which was approached by a steep descent of a few odd steps, diverging from the main staircase nearly opposite to Mrs. Clennam's door. It could scarcely be said to be within call. The walls, doors, and panelling of the old place were so cumbrous, but it was within easy reach, in any undress, at any hour of the night, in any temperature. At the head of the bed, and within a foot of Mrs. Flintwinch's ear, was a bell, the line of which hung ready to Mrs. Clennam's hand. Whenever this bell rang, up started Affery, and was in the sick-room before she was awake. Having got her mistress into bed, lighted her lamp, and given her good night, Mrs. Flintwinch went to roost as usual, saving that her lord had not yet appeared. It was her lord himself who became, unlike the last theme in the mind, according to the observation of most philosophers, the subject of Mrs. Flintwinch's dream. It seemed to her that she awoke after sleeping some hours, and found Jeremiah not yet abed. That she looked at the candle she had left burning, and measuring the time like King Alfred the Great, was confirmed by its wasted state in her belief that she had been asleep for some considerable period. That she arose thereupon, muffled herself up in a wrapper, put on her shoes, and went out on the staircase, much surprised, to look for Jeremiah. The staircase was as wooden and solid as need be, and Affery went straight down it without any of those deviations peculiar to dreams. She did not skim over it, but walked down it, and guided herself by the banisters on account of her candle having died out. In one corner of the hall, behind the house-door, there was a little waiting-room, like a well shaft, with a long narrow window in it, as if it had been ripped up. In this room, which was never used, a light was burning. Mrs. Flintwinch crossed the hall, feeling its pavement cold to her stockingless feet, and peeped in between the rusty hinges on the door, which stood a little open. She expected to see Jeremiah fast asleep, or in a fit, but he was calmly seated in a chair, awake, and in his usual health. But what? Hey! Lord forgive us! Mrs. Flintwinch muttered some ejaculation to this effect, and turned giddy. For Mr. Flintwinch, awake, was watching Mr. Flintwinch asleep. He sat on one side of the small table, looking keenly at himself on the other side with his chin sunk on his breast, snoring. The waking Flintwinch had his full front face presented to his wife. The sleeping Flintwinch was in profile. The waking Flintwinch was the old original. The sleeping Flintwinch was the double. Just as she might have distinguished between a tangible object and its reflection in a glass, Affery made out this difference with her head going round and round. If she had had any doubt which was her own Jeremiah, it would have been resolved by his impatience. He looked about him for an offensive weapon, caught up the snuffers, and before applying them to the cabbage-headed candle, lunged at the sleeper as though he would have run him through the body. "Who's that? What's the matter?" cried the sleeper, starting. Mr. Flintwinch made a movement with the snuffers, as if he would have enforced silence on his companion by putting them down his throat. The companion, coming to himself, said, rubbing his eyes, "I forgot where I was." "You have been asleep?" snarled Jeremiah, referring to his watch. 2 hours. You said you would be rested enough if you had a short nap." "I have had a short nap," said Double. 2:30 in the morning, muttered Jeremiah. "Where's your hat? Where's your coat? Where's the box?" "All here," said Double, tying up his throat with sleepy carefulness in a shawl. "Stop a minute. Now give me the sleeve. Not that sleeve, the other one. Ha! I'm not as young as I was." Mr. Flintwinch had pulled him into his coat with vehement energy. "You promised me a second glass after I was rested." "Drink it," returned Jeremiah, "and choke yourself, I was going to say, but go I mean." At the same time he produced the identical port-wine bottle, and filled a wine glass. "Her port-wine, I believe," said Double, tasting it as if he were in the docks, with hours to spare. "Her health." He took a sip. "Your health." He took another sip. "His health." He took another sip. "And all friends round St. Paul's." He emptied and put down the wine-glass half-way through this ancient civic toast, and took up the box. It was an iron box some 2 feet square, which he carried under his arms pretty easily. Jeremiah watched his manner of adjusting it, with jealous eyes. Tried it with his hands to be sure that he had a firm hold of it, bade him for his life be careful what he was about, and then stole out on tiptoe to open the door for him. Affery, anticipating the last movement, was on the staircase. The sequence of things was so ordinary and natural, that, standing there, she could hear the door open, feel the night air, and see the stars outside. But now came the most remarkable part of the dream. She felt so afraid of her husband that, being on the staircase, she had not the power to retreat to her room, which she might easily have done before he had fastened the door, but stood there staring. Consequently, when he came up the staircase to bed, candle in hand, he came full upon her. He looked astonished, but said not a word. He kept his eyes upon her, and kept advancing, and she, completely under his influence, kept retiring before him. Thus, she walking backward and he walking forward, they came into their own room. They were no sooner shut there than Mr. Flintwinch took her by the throat and shook her until she was black in the face. "Why, Affery, woman, Affery," said Mr. Flintwinch, "what have you been dreaming of? Wake up, wake up! What's the matter?" The matter, Jeremiah," gasped Mrs. Flintwinch, rolling her eyes. "Why, Affery, woman, Affery, you have been getting out of bed in your sleep, my dear. I come up after having fallen asleep myself below, and find you in your wrapper here with the nightmare. Affery, woman," said Mr. Flintwinch, with a friendly grin on his expressive countenance, "if you ever have a dream of this sort again, it'll be a sign of your being in want of physic, and I'll give you such a dose, old woman, such a dose." Mrs. Flintwinch thanked him, and crept into bed. End of chapter the 4th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 5th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 5th. Family Affairs. As the city clock struck 9 on Monday morning, Mrs. Clennam was wheeled by Jeremiah Flintwinch of the cut-down aspect to her tall cabinet. When she had unlocked and opened it, and had settled herself at its desk, Jeremiah withdrew, as it might be to hang himself more effectually, and her son appeared. "Are you any better this morning, mother?" She shook her head, with the same austere air of luxuriousness that she had shown overnight when speaking of the weather. "I shall never be better any more. It is well for me, Arthur, that I know it, and can bear it." Sitting with her hands laid separately upon the desk, and the tall cabinet towering before her, she looked as if she were performing on a dumb church organ. Her son thought so. It was an old thought with him, while he took his seat beside it. She opened a drawer or two, looked over some business papers, and put them back again. Her severe face had no thread of relaxation in it, by which any explorer could have been guided to the gloomy labyrinth of her thoughts. "Shall I speak of our affairs, mother? Are you inclined to enter upon business?" "Am I inclined, Arthur? Rather are you. Your father has been dead a year and more. I have been at your disposal, and waiting your pleasure ever since. There was much to arrange before I could leave, and when I did leave, I travelled a little for rest and relief." She turned her face towards him, as not having heard or understood his last words. "For rest and relief?" She glanced round the sombre room, and appeared from the motion of her lips to repeat the words to herself, as calling it to witness how little of either it afforded her. "Besides, mother, you being sole executrix, and having the direction and management of the estate, there remained little business, or I might say none, that I could transact until you had had time to arrange matters to your satisfaction." "The accounts are made out," she returned. "I have them here. The vouchers have all been examined and passed. You can inspect them when you like, Arthur. Now, if you please." "It is quite enough, mother, to know that the business is completed. Shall I proceed, then?" "Why not?" she said in her frozen way. "Mother, our house has done less and less for some years past, and our dealings have been progressively on the decline. We have never shown much confidence or invited much. We have attached no people to us. The track we have kept is not the track of the time, and we have been left far behind. I need not dwell on this to you, mother. You know it necessarily." "I know what you mean," she answered in a qualified tone. "Even this old house in which we speak," pursued her son, "is an instance of what I say. In my father's earlier time, and in his uncle's time before him, it was a place of business, really a place of business, and business resort. Now it is a mere anomaly and incongruity here, out of date and out of purpose. All our consignments have long been made to Rovingham's the commission merchants, and although, as a check upon them, and in the stewardship of my father's resources, your judgment and watchfulness have been actively exerted, still those qualities would have influenced my father's fortunes equally, if you had lived in any private dwelling, would they not?" "Do you consider," she returned without answering his question, "that a house serves no purpose, Arthur, in sheltering your infirm and afflicted, justly infirm and righteously afflicted mother?" "I was speaking only of business purposes." "With what object?" "I am coming to it." "I foresee," she returned, fixing her eyes upon him, "what it is. But the Lord forbid that I should repine under any visitation. In my sinfulness I merit bitter disappointment, and I accept it. Mother, I grieve to hear you speak like this, though I have had my apprehensions that you would." "You knew I would. You knew me," she interrupted. Her son paused for a moment. He had struck fire out of her, and was surprised. "Well," she said, relapsing into stone, "go on, let me hear." "You have anticipated, mother, that I decide for my part to abandon the business. I have done with it. I will not take upon myself to advise you. You will continue it, I see. If I had any influence with you, I would simply use it to soften your judgment of me in causing you this disappointment, to represent to you that I have lived the half of a long term of life, and have never before set my own will against yours. I cannot say that I have been able to conform myself in heart and spirit to your rules. I cannot say that I believe my 40 years have been profitable or pleasant to myself or any one, but I have habitually submitted, and I only ask you to remember it. Woe to the suppliant, if such a one there were or ever had been, who had any concession to look for in the inexorable face of the cabinet. Woe to the defaulter, whose appeal lay to the tribunal where those severe eyes presided. Great need had the rigid woman of her mystical religion, veiled in gloom and darkness, with lightnings of cursing, vengeance, and destruction, flashing through the sable clouds. "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors," was a prayer too poor in spirit for her. "Smite thou my debtors, Lord, wither them, crush them. Do thou as I would do, and thou shalt have my worship." This was the impious tower of stone she built up to scale heaven. "Have you finished, Arthur, or have you anything more to say to me?" "I think there can be nothing else. You have been short, but full of matter." "Mother, I have yet something more to say. It has been upon my mind, night and day, this long time. It is far more difficult to say than what I have said. That concerned myself. This concerns us all." "Us all? Who are us all?" "Yourself, myself, my dead father." She took her hands from the desk, folded them in her lap, and sat looking towards the fire, with the impenetrability of an old Egyptian sculpture. "You knew my father infinitely better than I ever knew him, and his reserve with me yielded to you. You were much the stronger, mother, and directed him. As a child, I knew it as well as I know it now. I knew that your ascendancy over him was the cause of his going to China to take care of the business there, while you took care of it here, though I do not even now know whether these were really terms of separation that you agreed upon, and that it was your will that I should remain with you until I was 20, and then go to him as I did. You will not be offended by my recalling this after 20 years. I am waiting to hear why you recall it." He lowered his voice and said, with manifest reluctance and against his will, "I want to ask you, mother, whether it ever occurred to you to suspect—" At the word suspect, she turned her eyes momentarily upon her son with a dark frown. She then suffered them to seek the fire as before, but with the frown fixed above them, as if the sculptor of old Egypt had intended it in the hard granite face to frown for ages. That he had any secret remembrance which caused him trouble of mind, remorse, whether you ever observed anything in his conduct suggesting that, or ever spoke to him upon it, or ever heard him hint at such a thing. I do not understand what kind of secret remembrance you mean to infer that your father was a prey to," she returned after a silence. "You speak so mysteriously." "Is it possible, mother?" Her son leaned forward to be the nearer to her while he whispered it, and laid his hand nervously upon her desk. "Is it possible, mother, that he had unhappily wronged anyone, and made no reparation?" Looking at him wrathfully, she bent herself back in her chair to keep him farther off, but gave him no reply. "I am deeply sensible, mother, that if this thought has never at any time flashed upon you, it must seem cruel and unnatural in me, even in this confidence, to breathe it, but I cannot shake it off. Time and change, I have tried both before breaking silence, do nothing to wear it out. Remember, I was with my father. Remember, I saw his face when he gave the watch into my keeping, and struggled to express that he sent it as a token you would understand to you. Remember, I saw him at the last with the pencil in his failing hand, trying to write some word for you to read, but to which he could give no shape. The more remote and cruel this vague suspicion that I have, the stronger the circumstances that could give it any semblance of probability to me. For heaven's sake, let us examine sacredly whether there is any wrong entrusted to us to set right. No one can help towards it, mother, but you." Still so recoiling in her chair, that her overpoised weight moved it from time to time a little on its wheels, and gave her the appearance of a phantom of fierce aspect gliding away from him. She interposed her left arm, bent at the elbow with the back of her hand towards her face, between herself and him, and looked at him in a fixed silence. "In grasping at money and in driving hard bargains, I have begun, and I must speak of such things now, mother. Someone may have been grievously deceived, injured, ruined. You were the moving power of all this machinery before my birth. Your stronger spirit has been infused into all my father's dealings for more than 20 years. You can set these doubts at rest, I think, if you will really help me to discover the truth. Will you, mother?" He stopped in the hope that she would speak, but her grey hair was not more immovable in its 2 folds than were her firm lips. "If reparation can be made to any one, if restitution can be made to any one, let us know it and make it. Nay, mother, if within my means, let me make it. I have seen so little happiness come of money, it has brought within my knowledge so little peace to this house, or to any one belonging to it, that it is worth less to me than to another. It can buy me nothing that will not be a reproach and misery to me, if I am haunted by a suspicion that it darkened my father's last hours with remorse, and that it is not honestly, unjustly mine." There was a bell rope hanging on the panelled wall, some 2 or 3 yards from the cabinet. By a swift and sudden action of her foot, she drove her wheeled chair rapidly back to it and pulled it violently, still holding her arm up in its shield-like posture, as if he were striking at her, and she warding off the blow. A girl came hurrying in, frightened. "Send Flintwinch here." In a moment the girl had withdrawn, and the old man stood within the door. "What? Your hammer and tongs already, too?" he said, coolly stroking his face. "I thought you would be. I was pretty sure of it. Flintwinch?" said the mother. "Look at my son. Look at him." "Well, I am looking at him," said Flintwinch. She stretched out the arm with which she had shielded herself, and as she went on pointed at the object of her anger. "In the very hour of his return, almost before the shoe upon his foot is dry, he asperses his father's memory to his mother, asks his mother to become with him a spy upon his father's transactions through a lifetime, has misgivings that the goods of this world, which we have painfully got together early and late, with wear and tear and toil and self-denial, are so much plunder, and asks to whom they shall be given up as reparation and restitution." Although she said this raging, she said it in a voice so far from being beyond her control that it was even lower than her usual tone. She also spoke with great distinctness. "Reparation," said she. "Yes, truly. It is easy for him to talk of reparation, fresh from journeying and junketing in foreign lands, and living a life of vanity and pleasure. But let him look at me, in prison and in bonds here. I endure without murmuring, because it is appointed that I shall so make reparation for my sins. Reparation! Is there none in this room? Has there been none here this 15 years? Thus was she always balancing her bargains with the majesty of heaven, posting up the entries to her credit, strictly keeping her set off, and claiming her due. She was only remarkable in this, for the force and emphasis with which she did it. Thousands upon thousands do it, according to their varying manner, every day. Flintwinch, give me that book." The old man handed it to her from the table. She put 2 fingers between the leaves, closed the book upon them, and held it up to her son in a threatening way. "In the days of old, Arthur, treated of in this commentary, there were pious men, beloved of the Lord, who would have cursed their sons for less than this, who would have sent them forth, and sent whole nations forth, if such had supported them, to be avoided of God and man, and perish, down to the baby at the breast. But I only tell you that if you ever renew that theme with me, I will renounce you. I will so dismiss you through that doorway, that you had better have been motherless from your cradle. I will never see or know you more. And if, after all, you were to come into this darkened room to look upon me lying dead, my body should bleed, if I could make it, when you came near me." In part relieved by the intensity of this threat, and in part, monstrous as the fact is, by a general impression that it was in some sort a religious proceeding, she handed back the book to the old man, and was silent. "Now," said Jeremiah, "premising that I am not going to stand between you two, will you let me ask, as I have been called in and made a third, what is all this about?" "Take your version of it," returned Arthur, finding it left to him to speak, "from my mother. Let it rest there. What I have said was said to my mother only." "Oh," returned the old man, "from your mother? Take it from your mother? Well, but your mother mentioned that you had been suspecting your father. That's not dutiful, Mr. Arthur. Who will you be suspecting next?" "Enough," said Mrs. Clennam, turning her face so that it was addressed for the moment to the old man only. "Let no more be said about this." "Yes, but stop a bit, the old man persisted. "Let us see how we stand. Have you told Mr. Arthur that he mustn't lay offences at his father's door? That he has no right to do it? That he has no ground to go upon?" "I tell him so now." "Ah, exactly," said the old man. "You tell him so now. You hadn't told him so before, and you tell him so now. Aye, that's right. You know I stood between you and his father so long that it seems as if death had made no difference, and I was still standing between you. So I will, and so in fairness I require to have that plainly put forward. Arthur, you please to hear that you have no right to mistrust your father, and have no ground to go upon." He put his hands to the back of the wheeled chair, and muttering to himself, slowly wheeled his mistress back to her cabinet. "Now," he resumed, standing behind her, "in case I should go away leaving things half done, and so should be wanted again when you come to the other half and get into one of your flights, has Arthur told you what he means to do about the business?" "He has relinquished it." "In favour of nobody, I suppose?" Mrs. Clennam glanced at her son, leaning against one of the windows. He observed the look and said, "To my mother, of course. She does what she pleases." "And if any pleasure," she said after a short pause, "could arise for me out of the disappointment of my expectations that my son, in the prime of his life, would infuse new youth and strength into it, and make it of great profit and power, it would be in advancing an old and faithful servant. Jeremiah, the captain deserts the ship, but you and I will sink or float with it." Jeremiah, whose eyes glistened as if they saw money, darted a sudden look at the son, which seemed to say, "I owe you no thanks for this. You have done nothing towards it," and then told the mother that he thanked her, and that Affery thanked her, and that he would never desert her, and that Affery would never desert her. Finally he hauled up his watch from its depths and said, 11, time for your oysters." And with that change of subject, which involved no change of expression or manner, rang the bell. But Mrs. Clennam, resolved to treat herself with a greater rigour for having been supposed to be unacquainted with reparation, refused to eat her oysters when they were brought. They looked tempting, 8 in number, circularly set out on a white plate on a tray covered with a white napkin, flanked by a slice of buttered French roll and a little compact glass of cool wine and water. But she resisted all persuasions, and sent them down again, placing the act to her credit, no doubt, in her eternal day book. This refection of oysters was not presided over by Affery, but by the girl who had appeared when the bell was rung, the same who had been in the dimly lighted room last night. Now that he had an opportunity of observing her, Arthur found that her diminutive figure, small features, and slight spare dress gave her the appearance of being much younger than she was. A woman, probably of not less than 22, she might have been passed in the street for little more than half that age. Not that her face was very youthful, for in truth there was more consideration and care in it than naturally belonged to her utmost years. But she was so little and light, so noiseless and shy, and appeared so conscious of being out of place among the 3 hard elders, that she had all the manner and much of the appearance of a subdued child. In a hard way, and in an uncertain way that fluctuated between patronage and putting down, the sprinkling from a watering pot and hydraulic pressure, Mrs. Clennam showed an interest in this dependant. Even in the moment of her entrance, upon the violent ringing of the bell, when the mother shielded herself with that singular action from the son, Mrs. Clennam's eyes had had some individual recognition in them which seemed reserved for her. As there are degrees of hardness in the hardest metal, and shades of colour in black itself, so, even in the asperity of Mrs. Clennam's demeanour towards all the rest of humanity and towards little Dorrit, there was a fine gradation. Little Dorrit let herself out to do needlework. At so much a day, or at so little, from 8 to 8, little Dorrit was to be hired. Punctual to the moment, little Dorrit appeared. Punctual to the moment, little Dorrit vanished. What became of little Dorrit between the 2 8s was a mystery. Another of the moral phenomena of little Dorrit. Besides her consideration money, her daily contract included meals. She had an extraordinary repugnance to dining in company, would never do so, if it were possible to escape, would always plead that she had this bit of work to begin first, or that bit of work to finish first, and would of a certainty scheme and plan, not very cunningly it would seem, for she deceived no one, to dine alone. Successful in this, happy in carrying off her plate anywhere to make a table of her lap, or a box, or the ground, or even, as was supposed, to stand on tiptoe, dining moderately at a mantel-shelf. the great anxiety of little Dorrit's day was set at rest. It was not easy to make out little Dorrit's face. She was so retiring, plied her needle in such removed corners, and started away so scared if encountered on the stairs. But it seemed to be a pale transparent face, quick in expression though not beautiful in feature, its soft hazel eyes excepted. A delicately bent head, a tiny form, a quick little pair of busy hands, and a shabby dress. It must needs have been very shabby to look at all so, being so neat, were little Dorrit as she sat at work. For these particulars or generalities concerning little Dorrit, Mr. Arthur was indebted in the course of the day to his own eyes and to Mrs. Affery's tongue. If Mrs. Affery had had any will or way of her own, it would probably have been unfavourable to little Dorrit. But as them two clever ones, Mrs. Affery's perpetual reference, in whom her personality was swallowed up, were agreed to accept little Dorrit as a matter of course, she had nothing for it but to follow suit. Similarly, if the two clever ones had agreed to murder little Dorrit by candlelight, Mrs. Affery, being required to hold the candle, would no doubt have done it. In the intervals of roasting the partridge for the invalid chamber, and preparing a baking dish of beef and pudding for the dining-room, Mrs. Affery made the communications above set forth, invariably putting her head in at the door again after she had taken it out, to enforce resistance to the two clever ones. It appeared to have become a perfect passion with Mrs. Flintwinch, that the only son should be pitted against them. In the course of the day, too, Arthur looked through the whole house. Dull and dark he found it. The gaunt rooms, deserted for years upon years, seemed to have settled down into a gloomy lethargy, from which nothing could rouse them again. The furniture, at once spare and lumbering, hid in the rooms rather than furnished them, and there was no colour in all the house. Such colour as had ever been there, had long ago started away on lost sunbeams, got itself absorbed, perhaps into flowers, butterflies, plumage of birds, precious stones, what not. There was not one straight floor from the foundation to the roof. The ceilings were so fantastically clouded by smoke and dust, that old women might have told fortunes in them better than in grouts of tea. The dead, cold hearths showed no traces of having ever been warmed but in heaps of soot that had tumbled down the chimneys, and eddied about in little dusky whirlwinds when the doors were opened. In what had once been a drawing-room, there were a pair of meagre mirrors, with dismal processions of black figures carrying black garlands, walking round the frames, but even these were short of heads and legs, and one undertaker like Cupid had swung round on its own axis, and got upside down, and another had fallen off altogether. The room Arthur Clennam's deceased father had occupied for business purposes, when he first remembered him, was so unaltered that he might have been imagined still to keep it invisibly, as his visible relict kept her room upstairs. Jeremiah Flintwinch still going between them negotiating. His picture, dark and gloomy, earnestly speechless on the wall, with the eyes intently looking at his son as they had looked when life departed from them, seemed to urge him awfully to the task he had attempted. But as to any yielding on the part of his mother, he had now no hope, and as to any other means of setting his distrust at rest, he had abandoned hope a long time. Down in the cellars, as up in the bed-chambers, old objects that he well remembered were changed by age and decay, but were still in their old places. Even to empty beer-casks hoary with cobwebs, and empty wine-bottles with fur and fungus choking up their throats. There, too, among unusual bottle-racks and pale slants of light from the yard above, was the strong room stored with old ledgers, which had as musty and corrupt a smell as if they were regularly balanced in the dead small hours by a nightly resurrection of old book-keepers. The baking dish was served up in a penitential manner on a shrunken cloth at an end of the dining-table at 2:00, when he dined with Mr. Flintwinch, the new partner. Mr. Flintwinch informed him that his mother had recovered her equanimity now, and that he need not fear her again alluding to what had passed in the morning. "And don't you lay offences at your father's door, Mr. Arthur," added Jeremiah. "Once for all, don't do it. Now we have done with the subject." Mr. Flintwinch had been already rearranging and dusting his own particular little office, as if to do honour to his accession to new dignity. He resumed this occupation when he was replete with beef, had sucked up all the gravy in the baking dish with the flat of his knife, and had drawn liberally on a barrel of small beer in the scullery. Thus refreshed, he tucked up his shirt-sleeves and went to work again, and Mr. Arthur, watching him as he set about it, plainly saw that his father's picture, or his father's grave, would be as communicative with him as this old man. "Now, a free woman," said Mr. Flintwinch, as she crossed the hall. "You hadn't made Mr. Arthur's bed when I was up there last. Stir yourself, bustle." But Mr. Arthur found the house so blank and dreary, and was so unwilling to assist at another implacable consignment of his mother's enemies, perhaps himself among them, to mortal disfigurement and immortal ruin, that he announced his intention of lodging at the coffee-house where he had left his luggage. Mr. Flintwinch taking kindly to the idea of getting rid of him, and his mother being indifferent, beyond considerations of saving, to most domestic arrangements that were not bounded by the walls of her own chamber, he easily carried this point without new offence. Daily business hours were agreed upon, which his mother, Mr. Flintwinch, and he were to devote together to a necessary checking of books and papers, and he left the home he had so lately found, with depressed heart. But little Dorrit! The business hours, allowing for intervals of invalid regimen of oysters and partridges, during which Clennam refreshed himself with a walk, were from 10 to 6 for about a fortnight. Sometimes little Dorrit was employed at her needle, sometimes not, sometimes appeared as a humble visitor, which must have been her character on the occasion of his arrival. His original curiosity augmented every day, as he watched for her, saw or did not see her, and speculated about her. Influenced by his predominant idea, he even fell into a habit of discussing with himself the possibility of her being in some way associated with it. At last he resolved to watch little Dorrit, and know more of her story. End of chapter the 5th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 6th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 6th. The Father of the Marshalsea. 30 years ago there stood, a few doors short of the church of St. George, in the borough of Southwark, on the left-hand side of the way going southward, the Marshalsea prison. It had stood there many years before, and it remained there some years afterwards, but it is gone now, and the world is none the worse without it. It was an oblong pile of barrack building, partitioned into squalid houses standing back to back, so that there were no back rooms, environed by a narrow paved yard, hemmed in by high walls duly spiked at top. Itself a close and confined prison for debtors, it contained within it a much closer and more confined jail for smugglers. Offenders against the revenue laws, and defaulters to excise or customs who had incurred fines which they were unable to pay, were supposed to be incarcerated behind an iron-plated door closing up a second prison, consisting of a strong cell or two, and a blind alley some yard and a half wide, which formed the mysterious termination of the very limited skittle-ground in which the Marshalsea debtors bowled down their troubles. Supposed to be incarcerated there, because the time had rather outgrown the strong cells and the blind alley. In practice they had come to be considered a little too bad, though in theory they were quite as good as ever, which may be observed to be the case at the present day with other cells that are not at all strong, and with other blind alleys that are stone blind. Hence the smugglers habitually consorted with the debtors, who received them with open arms, except at certain constitutional moments when somebody came from some office to go through some form of overlooking something which neither he nor anybody else knew anything about. On these truly British occasions, the smugglers, if any, made a feint of walking into the strong cells and the blind alley, while this somebody pretended to do his something, and made a reality of walking out again as soon as he hadn't done it, neatly epitomizing the administration of most of the public affairs in our tight little island. There had been taken to the Marshalsea prison long before the day when the sun shone on Marseille, and on the opening of this narrative, a debtor with whom this narrative had some concern. He was, at that time, a very amiable and very helpless middle-aged gentleman, who was going out again directly. Necessarily, he was going out again directly because the Marshalsea lock never turned upon a debtor who was not. He brought in a portmanteau with him, which he doubted its being worth while to unpack. He was so perfectly clear, like all the rest of them, the turnkey on the lock said, that he was going out again directly. He was a shy, retiring man, well-looking, though in an effeminate style, with a mild voice, curling hair, and irresolute hands, rings upon the fingers in those days, which nervously wandered to his trembling lip 100 times in the first half-hour of his acquaintance with the jail. His principal anxiety was about his wife. "Do you think, sir," he asked the turnkey, "that she will be very much shocked if she should come to the gate tomorrow morning?" The turnkey gave it as the result of his experience that some of 'em was and some of 'em wasn't. In general, more no than yes. "What like is she, you see?" he philosophically asked. "That's what it hinges on." "She is very delicate and inexperienced indeed." "That," said the turnkey, "is again her." "She is so little used to go out alone," said the debtor, "that I am at a loss to think how she will ever make her way here if she walks." "Perhaps," quoth the turnkey, "she'll take her hackney coach." "Perhaps." The irresolute fingers went to the trembling lip. "I hope she will. She may not think of it." "Or perhaps," said the turnkey, offering his suggestions from the top of his well-worn wooden stool, as he might have offered them to a child for whose weakness he felt a compassion, "perhaps she'll get her brother or her sister to come along with her." "She has no brother or sister." "Niece, nevy, cousin, servant, young woman, greengrocer, dash it, one or another on 'em," said the turnkey, repudiating beforehand the refusal of all his suggestions. "I hope it is not against the rules that she will bring the children." "The children?" said the turnkey. "And the rules? Why, Lord set you up like a corner pin. We've a regular playground of children here. Children? Why, we swarm with them. How many are you got?" "2," said the debtor, lifting his irresolute hand to his lip again, and turning into the prison. The turnkey followed him with his eyes. "And you another," he observed to himself, "which makes 3 on you. And your wife another, I'll lay a crown, which makes 4 on you. And another coming, I'll lay 1/2 crown, which'll make 5 on you. And I'll go another 7 and 6pence to Naim, which is the helplessest, the unborn baby o' you." He was right in all his particulars. She came next day with a little boy of 3 years old, and a little girl of 2, and he stood entirely corroborated. "Got a room now, haven't you?" the turnkey asked the debtor after a week or 2. "Yes, I have got a very good room." "Any little sticks are coming to furnish it?" said the turnkey. "I expect a few necessary articles of furniture to be delivered by the carrier this afternoon." "Mrs. and little uns are coming to keep you company?" asked the turnkey. "Why, yes, we think it better that we should not be scattered, even for a few weeks." "Even for a few weeks, of course," replied the turnkey, and he followed him again with his eyes, and nodded his head 7 times when he was gone. The affairs of this debtor were perplexed by a partnership of which he knew no more than he had invested money in it, by legal matters of assignment and settlement, conveyance here and conveyance there, suspicion of unlawful preference of creditors in this direction, and of mysterious spiriting away of property in that, and as nobody on the face of the earth could be more incapable of explaining any single item in the heap of confusion than the debtor himself, nothing comprehensible could be made of his case. To question him in detail, and endeavour to reconcile his answers, to closet him with accountants and sharp practitioners learned in the wiles of insolvency and bankruptcy, was only to put the case out at compound interest and incomprehensibility. The irresolute fingers fluttered more and more ineffectually about the trembling lip on every such occasion, and the sharpest practitioners gave him up as a hopeless job. "Out," said the turnkey. "He'll never get out unless his creditors take him by the shoulders and shove him out." He had been there 5 or 6 months, when he came running to this turnkey one forenoon to tell him, breathless and pale, that his wife was ill. "As anybody might have known she would be," said the turnkey. "We intended," he returned, "that she should go to a country lodging only to-morrow. What am I to do? Oh, good heaven, what am I to do?" "Don't waste your time in clasping your hands and biting your fingers," responded the practical turnkey, taking him by the elbow, "but come along with me." The turnkey conducted him, trembling from head to foot, and constantly crying under his breath, what was he to do, while his irresolute fingers bedabbled the tears upon his face, up one of the common staircases in the prison to a door on the garret story, upon which door the turnkey knocked with the handle of his key. "Come in," cried a voice inside. The turnkey, opening the door, disclosed in a wretched, ill-smelling little room 2 hoarse, puffy, red-faced personages seated in a rickety table, playing at all fours, smoking pipes, and drinking brandy. "Doctor," said the turnkey, "here's a gentleman's wife in want of you without a minute's loss of time." The doctor's friend was in the positive degree of hoarseness, puffiness, red-facedness, all fours, tobacco, dirt, and brandy. The doctor in the comparative, hoarser, puffier, more red-faced, more all-foury, tobaccoer, dirtier, and brandier. The doctor was amazingly shabby, in a torn and darned rough-weather sea-jacket, out at elbows and eminently short of buttons. He had been in his time the experienced surgeon carried by a passenger ship, the dirtiest white trousers conceivable by mortal man, carpet slippers, and no visible linen. "Childbed?" said the doctor. "I'm the boy." With that the doctor took a comb from the chimney-piece and stuck his hair upright, which appeared to be his way of washing himself, produced a professional chest or case, of most abject appearance, from the cupboard where his cup and saucer and coals were, settled his chin in a frowsy wrap around his neck, and became a ghastly medical scarecrow. The doctor and the debtor ran downstairs, leaving the turnkey to return to the lock, and made for the debtor's room. All the ladies in the prison had got hold of the news, and were in the yard. Some of them had already taken possession of the 2 children, and were hospitably carrying them off. Others were offering loans of little comforts from their own scanty store. Others were sympathizing with the greatest volubility. The gentlemen prisoners, feeling themselves at a disadvantage, had for the most part retired, not to say sneaked, to their rooms, from the open windows of which some of them now complimented the doctor with whistles as he passed below, while others, with several stories between them, interchanged sarcastic references to the prevalent excitement. It was a hot summer day, and the prison rooms were baking between the high walls. In the debtor's confined chamber, Mrs. Bangham, charwoman and messenger, who was not a prisoner, though she had been once, but was the popular medium of communication with the outer world, had volunteered her services as fly-catcher and general attendant. The walls and ceiling were blackened with flies. Mrs. Bangham, expert in sudden device, with one hand fanned the patient with a cabbage leaf, and with the other set traps of vinegar and sugar in gallipots, at the same time enunciating sentiments of an encouraging and congratulatory nature, adapted to the occasion. "The flies trouble you, don't they, my dear?" said Mrs. Bangham. "But perhaps they'll take your mind off of it, and do you good. What between the burying ground, the grocers, the waggon stables, and the paunch trade, the Marshalsea flies gets very large. Perhaps they're sent as a consolation if we only knowed it. How are you now, my dear? No better? No, my dear, it ain't to be expected. You'll be worse before you're better, and you know it, don't you? Yes, that's right. And to think of a sweet little cherub being born inside the lock. Now ain't it pretty? Ain't that something to carry you through it pleasant? Why, we ain't had such a thing happen here, my dear, not for I couldn't name the time when. And you are crying too," said Mrs. Bangham, to rally the patient more and more. "You, making yourself so famous, with the flies a-falling into the gallipots by 50s, and everything a-going on so well. And here if there ain't," said Mrs. Bangham as the door opened, "if there ain't your dear gentleman along with Dr. Haggage. And now indeed we are complete, I think." The doctor was scarcely the kind of apparition to inspire a patient with a sense of absolute completeness, but as he presently delivered the opinion, "We are as right as we can be, Mrs. Bangham, and we shall come out of this like a house afire," and as he and Mrs. Bangham took possession of the poor helpless pair, as everybody else and anybody else had always done, the means at hand were as good on the whole as better would have been. The special feature in Dr. Haggage's treatment of the case was his determination to keep Mrs. Bangham up to the mark, as thus: "Mrs. Bangham," said the doctor, before he had been there 20 minutes, "go outside and fetch a little brandy, or we shall have you giving in." "Thank you, sir, but none on my accounts," said Mrs. Bangham. "Mrs. Bangham," returned the doctor, "I am in professional attendance on this lady, and don't choose to allow any discussion on your part. Go outside and fetch a little brandy, or I foresee that you'll break down." "You are to be obeyed, sir," said Mrs. Bangham, rising. "If you was to put your own lips to it, I think you wouldn't be the worse, for you look but poorly, sir." "Mrs. Bangham," returned the doctor, "I am not your business, thank you, but you are mine. Never you mind me, if you please. What you have got to do is to do as you are told, and to go and get what I bid you." Mrs. Bangham submitted, and the doctor, having administered her potion, took his own. He repeated the treatment every hour, being very determined with Mrs. Bangham. 3 or 4 hours passed. The flies fell into the traps by hundreds, and at length one little life, hardly stronger than theirs, appeared among the multitude of lesser deaths. "A very nice little girl indeed," said the doctor. "Little but well formed. Hullo, Mrs. Bangham, you're looking queer. You be off, ma'am, this minute, and fetch a little more brandy, or we shall have you in hysterics." By this time the rings had begun to fall from the debtor's irresolute hands, like leaves from a wintry tree. Not one was left upon them that night, when he put something that chinked into the doctor's greasy palm. In the meantime, Mrs. Bangham had been out on an errand to a neighbouring establishment decorated with 3 golden balls, where she was very well known. "Thank you," said the doctor. "Thank you. Your good lady is quite composed. Doing charmingly." "I am very happy and very thankful to know it," said the debtor, "though I little thought once that—" "That a child would be born to you in a place like this," said the doctor. "Bah, bah, sir, what does it signify? A little more elbow room is all we want here. We are quiet here. We don't get badgered here. There is no knocker here, sir, to be hammered at by creditors and bring a man's heart into his mouth. Nobody comes here to ask if a man's at home, and to say he'll stand on the doormat till he is. Nobody writes threatening letters about money to this place. It's freedom, sir, it's freedom. I have had to-day's practice at home and abroad, on a march, and aboard ship, and I'll tell you this, I don't know that I have ever pursued it under such quiet circumstances as here this day. Elsewhere people are restless, worried, hurried about, anxious respecting one thing, anxious respecting another. Nothing of the kind here, sir. We have done all that, we know the worst of it. We have got to the bottom, we can't fall, and what have we found? Peace. That's the word for it. Peace. With this profession of faith, the doctor, who was an old jailbird, and was more sodden than usual, and had the additional and unusual stimulus of money in his pocket, returned to his associate and chum in hoarseness, puffiness, red-facedness, all fours, tobacco, dirt, and brandy. Now, the debtor was a very different man from the doctor, but he had already begun to travel by his opposite segment of the circle to the same point. Crushed at first by his imprisonment, he had soon found a dull relief in it. He was under lock and key, but the lock and key that kept him in kept numbers of his troubles out. If he had been a man with strength of purpose to face those troubles and fight them, he might have broken the net that held him, or broken his heart. But being what he was, he languidly slipped into this smooth descent and never more took one step upward. When he was relieved of the perplexed affairs that nothing would make plain, through having them returned upon his hands by a dozen agents in succession who could make neither beginning, middle, nor end of them or him, he found his miserable place of refuge a quieter refuge than it had been before. He had unpacked the portmanteau long ago, and his elder children now played regularly about the yard, and everybody knew the baby, and claimed a kind of proprietorship in her. "Why, I'm getting proud of you," said his friend the turnkey one day. "You'll be the oldest inhabitant soon. The Marshalsea wouldn't be like the Marshalsea now without you and your family." The turnkey really was proud of him. He would mention him in laudatory terms to newcomers when his back was turned. "You took notice of him," he would say, "that went out of the lodge just now?" Newcomer would probably answer, "Yes." "Brought up as a gentleman he was, if ever a man was. Educated at no end of expense. Went into the Marshal's house once to try a new piano for him. Played it, I understand, like 1 o'clock. Beautiful. As to languages, speaks anything. We've had a Frenchman here in his time, and it's my opinion he knowed more French than the Frenchman did. We've had an Italian here in his time, and he shut him up in about half a minute. You'll find some characters behind other locks. I don't say you won't. But if you want the top sawyer in such respects as I have mentioned, you must come to the Marshalsea." When his youngest child was 8 years old, his wife, who had long been languishing away, of her own inherent weakness, not that she retained any greater sensitiveness as to her place of abode than he did, went upon a visit to a poor friend and old nurse in the country, and died there. He remained shut up in his room for a fortnight afterwards, and an attorney's clerk, who was going through the insolvent court, engrossed an address of condolence to him, which looked like a lease, and which all the prisoners signed. When he appeared again, he was greyer. He had soon begun to turn grey, and the turnkey noticed that his hands went often to his trembling lips again, as they had used to do when he first came in. But he got pretty well over it in a month or two, and in the meantime the children played about the yard as regularly as ever, but in black. Then Mrs. Bangham, long popular medium of communication with the outer world, began to be infirm, and to be found oftener than usual comatose on pavements, with her basket of purchases spilt, and the change of her clients 9d. short. His son began to supersede Mrs. Bangham, and to execute commissions in a knowing manner, and to be of the prisoners, of the streets streety. Time went on, and the turnkey began to fail. His chest swelled, and his legs got weak, and he was short of breath. The well-worn wooden stool was beyond him, he complained. He sat in an arm-chair with a cushion, and sometimes wheezed so, for minutes together, that he couldn't turn the key. When he was overpowered by these fits, the debtor often turned it for him. "You and me," said the turnkey one snowy winter's night when the lodge, with a bright fire in it, was pretty full of company, "is the oldest inhabitants. I wasn't here myself about 7 year before you. I shan't last long. When I'm off the lock for good and all, you'll be the father of the Marshalsea." The turnkey went off the lock of this world next day. His words were remembered and repeated, and tradition afterwards handed down from generation to generation. A Marshalsea generation might be calculated as about 3 months, that the shabby old debtor with the soft manner and the white hair was the father of the Marshalsea. And he grew to be proud of the title. If any impostor had arisen to claim it, he would have shed tears in resentment of the attempt to deprive him of his rights. A disposition began to be perceived in him to exaggerate the number of years he had been there. It was generally understood that you must deduct a few from his account. He was vain, the fleeting generations of debtors said. All newcomers were presented to him. He was punctilious in the exaction of this ceremony. The wits would perform the office of introduction with overcharged pomp and politeness, but they could not easily overstep his sense of its gravity. He received them in his poor room. He disliked an introduction in the mere yard, as informal, a thing that might happen to anybody, with a kind of bowed-down beneficence. They were welcome to the Marshalsea, he would tell them. Yes, he was the father of the place. So the world was kind enough to call him. And so he was, if more than 20 years of residence gave him a claim to the title. It looked small at first, but there was very good company there, among a mixture, necessarily a mixture, and very good air. It became a not unusual circumstance for letters to be put under his door at night, enclosing half a crown, 2 half-crowns, now and then at long intervals even half a sovereign, for the father of the Marshalsea, with the compliments of a collegian taking leave. He received the gifts as tributes from admirers to a public character. Sometimes these correspondents assumed facetious names, as the Brick, Bellows, Old Gooseberry, Wide Awake, Snooks, Mops, Cutaway, the Dog-meat Man. But he considered this in bad taste, and was always a little hurt by it. In the fullness of time, this correspondence showing signs of wearing out, and seeming to require an effort on the part of the correspondents to which in the hurried circumstances of departure many of them might not be equal, he established the custom of attending collegians of a certain standing to the gate, and taking leave of them there. The collegian under treatment, after shaking hands, would occasionally stop to wrap up something in a bit of paper, and would come back again calling, "Hi!" He would look round surprised. "Me?" he would say with a smile. By this time the collegian would be up with him, and he would paternally add, "What have you forgotten? What can I do for you?" "I forgot to leave this," the collegian would usually return, "for the father of the Marshalsea." "My good sir," he would rejoin, "he is infinitely obliged to you," but to the last the irresolute hand of the old would remain in the pocket into which he had slipped the money during 2 or 3 turns about the yard, lest the transaction should be too conspicuous to the general body of collegians. One afternoon he had been doing the honours of the place to a rather large party of collegians, who happened to be going out, when, as he was coming back, he encountered one from the poor side who had been taken in execution for a small sum a week before, had settled in the course of that afternoon, and was going out too. The man was a mere plasterer in his working dress, had his wife with him and a bundle, and was in high spirits. "God bless you, sir," he said in passing. "And you," benignantly returned the father of the Marshalsea. They were pretty far divided, going their several ways, when the plasterer called out, "I say, sir," and came back to him. "It ain't much," said the plasterer, putting a little pile of halfpence in his hand, "but it's well meant." The father of the Marshalsea had never been offered tribute in copper yet. His children often had, and with his perfect acquiescence it had gone into the common purse to buy meat that he had eaten, and drink that he had drunk. But fustian splashed with white lime, bestowing halfpence on him front to front, was new. "How dare you?" he said to the man, and feebly burst into tears. The plasterer turned him towards the wall, that his face might not be seen, and the action was so delicate, that the man was so penetrated with repentance, and asked pardon so honestly, that he could make him no less acknowledgment than, "I know you meant it kindly, say no more." "Bless your soul, sir," urged the plasterer, "I did indeed. I'd do more by you than the rest of 'em do, I fancy." "What would you do?" he asked. "I'd come back to see you after I was let out." "Give me the money again," said the other eagerly, "and I'll keep it and never spend it. Thank you for it, thank you. I shall see you again?" "If I live a week, you shall." They shook hands and parted. The collegians, assembled in symposium in the snuggery that night, marvelled what had happened to their father. He walked so late in the shadows of the yard, and seemed so downcast. End of chapter the 6th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 7th, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, chapter the 7th. The Child of the Marshalsea. The baby whose first draught of air had been tinctured with Dr. Haggett's brandy was handed down among the generations of collegians, like the tradition of their common parent. In the earlier stages of her existence, she was handed down in a literal and prosaic sense, it being almost a part of the entrance footing of every new collegian to nurse the child who had been born in the college. "By rights," remarked the turnkey when she was first shown to him, "I ought to be her godfather." The debtor irresolutely thought of it for a minute, and said, "Perhaps you wouldn't object to really being her godfather?" "Oh, I don't object," replied the turnkey, "if you don't." Thus it came to pass that she was christened one Sunday afternoon, when the turnkey, being relieved, was off the lock, and that the turnkey went up to the font of St. George's Church, and promised and vowed and renounced on her behalf, as he himself related when he came back, "like a good un." This invested the turnkey with a new proprietary share in the child, over and above his former official one. When she began to walk and talk, he became fond of her, bought a little armchair and stood it by the high fender of the lodge fireplace, liked to have her company when he was on the lock, and used to bribe her with cheap toys to come and talk to him. The child, for her part, soon grew so fond of the turnkey, that she would come climbing up the lodge steps of her own accord at all hours of the day. When she fell asleep in the little armchair by the high fender, the turnkey would cover her with his pocket handkerchief, and when she sat in it dressing and undressing a doll, which soon came to be unlike dolls on the other side of the lock, and to bear a horrible family resemblance to Mrs. Bangham, he would contemplate her from the top of his stool with exceeding gentleness. Witnessing these things, the collegians would express an opinion that the turnkey, who was a bachelor, had been cut out by nature for a family man. But the turnkey thanked them and said, no, on the whole it was enough to see other people's children there. At what period of her early life the little creature began to perceive that it was not the habit of all the world to live locked up in narrow yards surrounded by high walls with spikes at the top, would be a difficult question to settle. But she was a very, very little creature indeed, when she had somehow gained the knowledge that her clasp of her father's hand was to be always loosened at the door which the great key opened, and that while her own light steps were free to pass beyond it, his feet must never cross that line. A pitiful and plaintive look, with which she had begun to regard him when she was still extremely young, was perhaps a part of this discovery, with a pitiful and plaintive look for everything, indeed, but with something in it for only him that was like protection, this child of the Marshalsea and the child of the father of the Marshalsea sat by her friend the turnkey in the lodge, kept the family room, or wandered about the prison yard for the first 8 years of her life, with a pitiful and plaintive look for her wayward sister, for her idle brother, for the high blank walls, for the faded crowd they shut in, for the games of the prison children as they whooped and ran, and played at hide and seek, and made the iron bars of the inner gateway home. Wistful and wondering, she would sit in summer weather by the high fender in the lodge, looking up at the sky through the barred window, until, when she turned her eyes away, bars of light would arise between her and her friend, and she would see him through a grating too. "Thinking of the fields," the turnkey said once after watching her, "ain't you?" "Where are they?" she inquired. "Why, they're over there, my dear," said the turnkey with a vague flourish of his key. "Just about there." "Does anybody open them and shut them? Are they locked?" The turnkey was discomfited. "Well," he said, "not in general." "And they very pretty, Bob?" She called him Bob, by his own particular request and instruction. "Lovely, full of flowers. There's buttercups, and there's daisies, and there's—" The turnkey hesitated, being short of floral nomenclature. "There's dandelions and all manner of games." "Is it very pleasant to be there, Bob?" "Prime," said the turnkey. "Was father ever there?" "Ahem," coughed the turnkey. "Oh yes, he was there sometimes." "Is he sorry not to be there now?" "Not particular," said the turnkey. "Nor any of the people?" she asked, glancing at the listless crowd within. "Oh, are you quite sure and certain, Bob?" At this difficult point of the conversation Bob gave in, and changed the subject to hard bake, always his last resource when he found his little friend getting him into a political, social, or theological corner. But this was the origin of a series of Sunday excursions that these two curious companions made together. They used to issue from the lodge on alternate Sunday afternoons with great gravity, bound for some meadows or green lanes that had been elaborately appointed by the turnkey in the course of the week, and there she picked grass and flowers to bring home, while he smoked his pipe. Afterwards, there were tea gardens, shrimps, ale, and other delicacies, and then they would come back hand in hand, unless she was more than usually tired, and had fallen asleep on his shoulder. In those early days, the turnkey first began profoundly to consider a question which cost him so much mental labour that it remained undetermined on the day of his death. He decided to will and bequeath his little property of savings to his godchild, and the point arose, how could it be so tied up as that only she should have the benefit of it? His experience on the lock gave him such an acute perception of the enormous difficulty of tying up money with any approach to tightness, and contrariwise of the remarkable ease with which it got loose, that through a series of years he regularly propounded this knotty point to every new insolvent agent and other professional gentleman who passed in and out. "Supposing," he would say, stating the case with his key on the professional gentleman's waistcoat, "supposing a man wanted to leave his property to a young female, and wanted to tie it up so that nobody else should ever be able to make a grab at it, how would you tie up that property?" "Settle it strictly on herself," the professional gentleman would complacently answer. "But look here," quoth the turnkey, "supposing she had, say a brother, say a father, say a husband, who would be likely to make a grab at that property when she came into it, how about that?" "It would be settled on herself, and they would have no more legal claim on it than you," would be the professional answer. "Stop a bit," said the turnkey. "Supposing she was tender-hearted, and they came over her, where's your law for tying it up then?" The deepest character whom the turnkey sounded was unable to produce his law for tying such a knot as that. So the turnkey thought about it all his life, and died intestate after all. But that was long afterwards, when his goddaughter was past 16. The first half of that space of her life was only just accomplished, when her pitiful and plaintive look saw her father a widower. From that time the protection that her wondering eyes had expressed towards him became embodied in action, and the child of the Marshalsea took upon herself a new relation towards the father. At first, such a baby could do little more than sit with him, deserting her livelier place by the high fender, and quietly watching him. But this made her so far necessary to him that he became accustomed to her, and began to be sensible of missing her when she was not there. Through this little gate she passed out of childhood into the care-laden world. What her pitiful look saw, at that early time, in her father, in her sister, in her brother, in the jail, how much or how little of the wretched truth it pleased God to make visible to her, lies hidden with many mysteries. It is enough that she was inspired to be something which was not what the rest were, and to be that something different and laborious for the sake of the rest. Inspired? Yes. Shall we speak of the inspiration of a poet or a priest, and not of the heart impelled by love and self-devotion to the lowliest work in the lowliest way of life? With no earthly friend to help her, or so much as to see her, but the one so strangely assorted, with no knowledge even of the common daily tone and habits of the common members of the free community who are not shut up in prisons, born and bred in a social condition, false even with a reference to the falsest condition outside the walls, drinking from infancy of a well whose waters had their own peculiar stain, their own unwholesome and unnatural taste. The child of the Marshalsea began her womanly life. No matter through what mistakes and discouragements, what ridicule, not unkindly meant but deeply felt, of her youth and little figure, what humble consciousness of her own babyhood and want of strength, even in the matter of lifting and carrying, through how much weariness and hopelessness, and how many secret tears, she drudged on until recognized as useful, even indispensable. That time came. She took the place of eldest of the three, in all things but precedence, was the head of the fallen family, and bore in her own heart its anxieties and shames. At 13, she could read and keep accounts, that is, could put down in words and figures how much the bare necessaries that they wanted would cost, and how much less they had to buy them with. She had been, by snatches of a few weeks at a time, to an evening school outside, and got her sister and brother sent to day schools by desultory starts, during 3 or 4 years. There was no instruction for any of them at home, but she knew well, no one better, that a man so broken as to be the father of the Marshalsea could be no father to his own children. To these scanty means of improvement she added another of her own contriving. Once, among the heterogeneous crowd of inmates there appeared a dancing master. Her sister had a great desire to learn the dancing master's art, and seemed to have a taste that way. At 13 years old, the child of the Marshalsea presented herself to the dancing master with a little bag in her hand, and preferred her humble petition. "If you please, I was born here, sir." "Oh, you are the young lady, are you?" said the dancing master, surveying the small figure and uplifted face. "Yes, sir." "And what can I do for you?" said the dancing master. "Nothing for me, sir, thank you," anxiously undrawing the strings of the little bag. "But if, while you stay here, you could be so kind as to teach my sister cheap—" "My child, I'll teach her for nothing," said the dancing master, shutting up the bag. He was as good-natured a dancing master as ever danced to the insolvent court, and he kept his word. The sister was so apt a pupil, and the dancing master had such abundant leisure to bestow upon her, for it took him a matter of 10 weeks to set to his creditors, lead off, turn the commissioners, and right and left back to his professional pursuits, that wonderful progress was made. Indeed, the dancing master was so proud of it, and so wishful to display it before he left to a few select friends among the collegians, that at 6 o'clock on a certain fine morning, a minuet de la cour came off in the yard, the college rooms being of too confined proportions for the purpose, in which so much ground was covered, and the steps were so conscientiously executed, that the dancing master, having to play the kit besides, was thoroughly blown. The success of this beginning, which led to the dancing master's continuing his instruction after his release, emboldened the poor child to try again. She watched and waited months for a seamstress. In the fullness of time a milliner came in, and to her she repaired on her own behalf. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," she said, looking timidly round the door of the milliner, whom she found in tears and in bed, "but I was born here." Everybody seemed to hear of her as soon as they arrived, for the milliner sat up in bed, drying her eyes, and said, just as the dancing master had said, "Oh, you are the child, are you?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am sorry I haven't got anything for you," said the milliner, shaking her head. "It's not that, ma'am. If you please, I want to learn needlework." "Why should you do that?" returned the milliner. "With me before you, it has not done me much good." "Nothing, whatever it is, seems to have done anybody much good who comes here," she returned in all simplicity. "But I want to learn just the same." "I am afraid you are so weak, you see," the milliner objected. "I don't think I am weak, ma'am." "And you are so very, very little, you see," the milliner objected. "Yes, I am afraid I am very little indeed," returned the child of the Marshalsea, and so began to sob over that unfortunate defect of hers, which came so often in her way. The milliner, who was not morose or hard-hearted, only newly insolvent, was touched, took her in hand with goodwill, found her the most patient and earnest of pupils, and made her a cunning work-woman in course of time. In course of time, and in the very self-same course of time, the father of the Marshalsea gradually developed a new flower of character. The more fatherly he grew as to the Marshalsea, and the more dependent he became on the contributions of his changing family, the greater stand he made by his forlorn gentility. With the same hand that he pocketed a collegian's half-crown half an hour ago, he would wipe away the tears that streamed over his cheeks if any reference were made to his daughters earning their bread. So, over and above other daily cares, the child of the Marshalsea had always upon her the care of preserving the genteel fiction that they were all idle beggars together. The sister became a dancer. There was a ruined uncle in the family group, ruined by his brother, the father of the Marshalsea, and knowing no more how than his ruiner did, but accepting the fact as an inevitable certainty, on whom her protection devolved. Naturally a retired and simple man, he had shown no particular sense of being ruined at the time when that calamity fell upon him, further than that he left off washing himself when the shock was announced, and never took to that luxury any more. He had been a very indifferent musical amateur in his better days, and when he fell with his brother, resorted for support to playing a clarionet as dirty as himself in a small theatre orchestra. It was the theatre in which his niece became a dancer. He had been a fixture there a long time when she took her poor station in it, and he accepted the task of serving as her escort and guardian, just as he would have accepted an illness, a legacy, a feast, starvation, anything but soap. To enable this girl to earn her few weekly shillings, it was necessary for the child of the Marshalsea to go through an elaborate form with the father. "Fanny is not going to live with us just now, father. She will be here a good deal in the day, but she is going to live outside with uncle." "You surprise me. Why?" "I think uncle wants a companion, father. He would be attended to and looked after." "A companion? Passes much of his time here. And you attend to him and look after him, Amy, a great deal more than ever your sister will. You all go out so much, you all go out so much." This was to keep up the ceremony and pretence of his having no idea that Amy herself went out by the day to work. "But we are always glad to come home, father. Now are we not? And as to Fanny, perhaps besides keeping uncle company and taking care of him, it may be as well for her not quite to live here always. She was not born here as I was, you know, father." "Well, Amy, well, I don't quite follow you, but it's natural, I suppose, that Fanny should prefer to be outside, and even that she often should too. So you and Fanny and your uncle, my dear, shall have your own way. Good, good. I'll not meddle. Don't mind me." To get her brother out of the prison, out of the succession to Mrs. Bangham in executing commissions, and out of the slang interchange with very doubtful companions consequent upon both, was her hardest task. At 18 he would have dragged on from hand to mouth, from hour to hour, from penny to penny, until 80. Nobody got into the prison from whom he derived anything useful or good, and she could find no patron for him but her old friend and godfather. "Dear Bob," said she, "what is to become of poor Tip?" His name was Edward, and Ted had been transformed into Tip within the walls. The turnkey had strong private opinions as to what would become of poor Tip, and had even gone so far with the view of averting their fulfilment, as to sound Tip in reference to the expediency of running away and going to serve his country. But Tip had thanked him, and said he didn't seem to care for his country. "Well, my dear," said the turnkey, "something ought to be done with him. Suppose I try and get him into the law?" "That would be so good of you, Bob." The turnkey had now 2 points to put to the professional gentlemen as they passed in and out. He put this second one so perseveringly that a stool and 12 shillings a week were at last found for Tip in the office of an attorney in a great national palladium called the Palace Court, at that time one of a considerable list of everlasting bulwarks to the dignity and safety of Albion, whose places know them no more. Tip languished in Clifford's Inns for 6 months, and at the expiration of that term sauntered back one evening with his hands in his pockets, and incidentally observed to his sister that he was not going back again. "Not going back again?" said the poor little anxious child of the Marshalsea, always calculating and planning for Tip in the front rank of her charges. "I am so tired of it," said Tip, "that I have cut it." Tip tired of everything. With intervals of Marshalsea lounging, and Mrs. Bangham's succession, his small second mother, aided by her trusty friend, got him into a warehouse, into a market garden, into the hop trade, into the law again, into an auctioneer's, into a brewery, into a stockbroker's, into the law again, into a coach office, into a wagon office, into the law again, into a general dealer's, into a distillery, into the law again, into a wool house, into a dry goods house, into the Billingsgate trade, into the foreign fruit trade, and into the docks. But whatever Tip went into, he came out of tired, announcing that he had cut it. Wherever he went, this foredoomed Tip appeared to take the prison walls with him, and to set them up in such trade or calling, and to prowl about within their narrow limits in the old slipshod, purposeless, down-at-heel way, until the really movable Marshalsea walls asserted their fascination over him and brought him back. Nevertheless, the brave little creature did so fix her heart on her brother's rescue, that while he was wringing out these doleful changes, she pinched and scraped enough together to ship him for Canada. When he was tired of nothing to do, and disposed in its turn to cut even that, he graciously consented to go to Canada. And there was grief in her bosom over parting with him, and joy in the hope of his being put in a straight course at last. "God bless you, dear Tip. Don't be too proud to come and see us when you have made your fortune." "All right," said Tip, and went. But not all the way to Canada. In fact, not further than Liverpool. After making the voyage to that port from London, he found himself so strongly impelled to cut the vessel that he resolved to walk back again. Carrying out which intention, he presented himself before her at the expiration of a month, in rags, without shoes, and much more tired than ever. At length, after another interval of successorship to Mrs. Bangham, he found a pursuit for himself, and announced it. "Amy, I have got a situation." "Have you really and truly, Tip?" "All right, I shall do now. You needn't look anxious about me any more, old girl." "What is it, Tip?" "Why, you know Slingo by sight?" "Not the man they call the dealer?" "That's the chap. He'll be out on Monday, and he's going to give me a berth." "What is he a dealer in, Tip?" "Horses. All right, I shall do now, Amy." She lost sight of him for months afterwards, and only heard from him once. A whisper passed among the elder collegians that he had been seen at a mock auction in Moorfields, pretending to buy plated articles for massive silver, and paying for them with the greatest liberality in bank notes. But it never reached her ears. One evening she was alone at work, standing up at the window, to save the twilight lingering above the wall, when he opened the door and walked in. She kissed and welcomed him, but was afraid to ask him any questions. He saw how anxious and timid she was, and appeared sorry. "I'm afraid, Amy, you'll be vexed this time. Upon my life I am." "I am very sorry to hear you say so, Tip. Have you come back?" "Why, yes." "Not expecting this time that what you had found would answer very well. I am less surprised and sorry than I might have been, Tip." "Oh, but that's not the worst of it." "Not the worst of it?" "Don't look so startled. No, Amy, not the worst of it. I have come back, you see, but don't look so startled. I have come back in what I may call a new way. I am off the volunteer list altogether. I am in now as one of the regulars." "Oh, don't say you are a prisoner, Tip. Don't! "Well, I don't want to say it," he returned in a reluctant tone. "But if you can't understand me without me saying it, what am I to do? I am in for £40 odd." For the first time in all those years, she sunk under her cares. She cried, with her clasped hands lifted above her head, that it would kill their father if he ever knew it, and fell down at Tip's graceless feet. It was easier for Tip to bring her to her senses than for her to bring him to understand that the father of the Marshalsea would be beside himself if he knew the truth. The thing was incomprehensible to Tip, and altogether a fanciful notion. He yielded to it in that light only when he submitted to her entreaties, backed by those of his uncle and sister. There was no want of precedent for his return. It was accounted for to the father in the usual way, and the collegians, with a better comprehension of the pious fraud than Tip, supported it loyally. This was the life, and this the history, of the child of the Marshalsea at 22, with a still surviving attachment to the one miserable yard and block of houses as her birthplace and home. She passed to and fro in it shrinkingly now, with a womanly consciousness that she was pointed out to every one. Since she had begun to work beyond the walls, she had found it necessary to conceal where she lived, and to come and go as secretly as she could, between the free city and the iron gates, outside of which she had never slept in her life. Her original timidity had grown with this concealment, and her light step and her little figure shunned the thronged streets while they passed along them. Worldly wise in hard and poor necessities, she was innocent in all things else. Innocent in the mist through which she saw her father, and the prison, and the turbid living river that flowed through it and flowed on. This was the life, and this the history, of little Dorrit, now going home upon a dull September evening, observed at a distance by Arthur Clennam. This was the life, and this the history of little Dorrit, turning at the end of London Bridge, recrossing it, going back again, passing on to St. George's Church, turning back suddenly once more, and flitting in at the open outer gate and little courtyard of the Marshalsea. End of chapter the 7th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain.